are taking some time.
And Craig, across the automakers, I'm looking at the reporting again. 7 of Tesla's 12 models sold in the U.S. fully cleared the IRA's sourcing hurdles and qualified for the tax credit. What percentage of EVs being sold in the U.S. are clearing that hurdle?
I think because Tesla is still so dominant in the U.S., we're at a point where the EVs that do the most volume are largely qualifying at the moment. But I think the fact that those raw material requirements that kick in next year and then escalate in the years that follow, that's really where we're going to see even more of a sort of level of screws put on the industry. But I think the other car maker that I think is particularly well positioned, I would just call out to General Motors. I think the fact that they have a localized supply chain for batteries, they have a joint venture with a Korean battery supplier. We're seeing more and more of those partnerships. Ford following suit, Stellantis, the maker of Jeep, and Chrysler. Similar deal where they're setting up battery plants in North America. And sort of on and on, but those projects, I would say, are much further behind where we have Tesla, which for years has been making batteries out in Nevada with Panasonic, and GM, which has a partnership with LG in U.S.
Hey, Craig, I think the narrative out there, just kind of the bigger picture on EVs right now is, gee, maybe demand isn't as high as we all thought at one point. We've got the big auto manufacturers pulling back, like Ford, for example. Loss is still big. What's your understanding when you talk to your sources as to how people are thinking about the ultimate demand for EVs over the next 1 to 3 to 5 years?
I think, perversely, it was a challenge that, for a time, business was too good. The fact that, for a while there, so many companies, actually had back orders. Tesla in particular, had demand issues as opposed to a supply issue. That, really sort of caused this, unsustainable, jacking up of prices. The fact that that has had to come down, I would say, more dramatically than we've seen for the rest of the industry has had all sorts of, unintended consequences. When you so dramatically bring down prices on the new side, the used side of the equation. The used vehicles really lose their value, and the fact that I think EVs maybe have some sort of particular challenges with maintaining their value. When you think about a used gas car, you don't worry about the engine holding up. You maybe have relatively more concern, rightfully or not, as to whether or not the battery is going to hold up. And so what we're seeing is that really come into play in terms of total cost of ownership. I think that's one of the things that we've really paid close attention to lately. I think when we step back, the fact that EVs is sort of the way forward, particularly in terms of where the regulators want to see this industry go. I think we've seen that China is able to make this work. We've seen that Europe is much further along in this transition. I think the question for the U.S. is whether we can sort of get Americans who tend to like bigger vehicles to come around to electric vehicles. I think that also adds some complications to the mix as well.
All right, Craig, thanks so much. As always, Craig Trudell, Global Autos Editor for Bloomberg News, joining us via Zoom from London. I tested, thanks to Matt Miller's connections with Ford. He got me a F-150 Lightning, the EV.
Ooh, yeah.
I got the test drive that for like a week.
How was it?
Awesome. Nice. Awesome. Now, I have to, full disclosure, I'm a Wall Street guy. I don't drive pickup trucks. So it's the first pickup truck I ever drove. It was awesome. And it's the first electric vehicle I ever drove. But the sticker price was $94,000. And I think it's just one of the challenges they have is just cost.
Yeah. No, well, and that's going to be, interestingly enough, we get earnings from Rivian and Lucid after the bell today. So we're going to hear how some of these smaller EV makers are hanging in there, just given, as you mentioned, high costs. These companies are losing money on pretty much every car or vehicle they make, and demand doesn't seem to really be there.
Yeah. So anyway, big take story coming out of Bloomberg News today, looking at the the battery side of it and kind of where we're sourcing all this stuff. So again, Bloomberg.com/big take, and that's where you'll find it. Right now, with our news in New York City, here's Michael Barr.
Thank you very much, Paul, Bailey, Lisa. The European Union approved today a modest new package of sanctions ahead of the 2-year mark since Russia invaded Ukraine and following the death of opposition leader Alexei Navalny in a Russian prison. The package is focusing much of its efforts on enforcing existing restrictions. Meanwhile, the Biden administration plans to impose new sanctions on Russia this Friday for the death of Alexei Navalny. Bloomberg's Nancy Lyons reports.
National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan says it will cover a range of elements in Russia's defense industrial base.
We have worked persistently and diligently to identify, to continue to impose costs for what Russia has done, for what it's done to Navalny, for what it's done to Ukraine, and for the threat that it represents to international peace and security.
Sullivan says what he calls the weakness and rot at the heart of the system Vladimir Putin has put in place is only confirmed by Alexei Navalny's death and the arrests of hundreds who mourned his passing. In Washington, Nancy Lyons, Bloomberg Radio.
Prosecutors say a former FBI informant charged with making up a multi-million-dollar bribery scheme involving President Joe Biden, his son Hunter, and a Ukrainian energy company had contacts with officials affiliated with Russian intelligence. It comes as a judge allowed Alexander Smirnov to be released from custody on electronic GPS monitoring. President Joe Biden's administration announced today that more than 150,000 borrowers will receive $1.2 billion in student loan forgiveness under a program unveiled in January. It seeks to provide relief for Americans who had been making payments for at least a decade. Global news, 24 hours a day and whenever you want it, with Bloomberg News Now. I'm Michael Barr, and this is Bloomberg.
events, headlines, and breaking news 24 hours a day at Bloomberg.com, on Bloomberg Television, and the Bloomberg Business app. This is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
The Bloomberg Interactive Broker Studio, I'm Lisa Mateo. A pretty slow start on Wall Street right now. The S&P 500 and the Dow Jones down about 0.2%. The NASDAQ leading the losses down about 0.6%. NVIDIA has a lot to do with it after it reports after the bell. Traders also, they're going to be sifting through minutes from the Fed's last meeting, any clues into central bankers' next steps. And recently, Fed Bank of Richmond President Thomas Barkin, he said recent economic data, it showed how price pressure in some sectors, well, it's just still too high despite improvement in overall inflation. Yields are higher. The 2-year yield at 4.61%, the 10-year at 4.27%, the 30-year at 4.45%. And of the 11 major industry groups, the biggest drag from information technology. Now, specifically systems, software, and then you start to look a little bit further under the hood, you see Palo Alto Networks. It's a cybersecurity company. It's at the top of the list, on track for its biggest decline in 7 years after its latest earnings report. That's Palo Alto Networks. That is your Bloomberg Business Flash. Paul and Bailey.
All right, very good. Lisa Mateo, thank you so much. We appreciate that. Bailey Lipschultz sitting in for Alex Steele. Paul Sweeney, we're here with you in the Bloomberg Interactive Broker Studio. We're streaming live on YouTube as well, so head over to youtube.com and search Bloomberg Radio. Looking at Bitcoin here in memory of Matt Miller, boy, since the March low of last year, it's up about 155%. It just had such a huge move, and there's a lot of reasons behind that, including we got a spot Bitcoin ETF, which I think the crypto kids are all happy about. Kavita Gupta joins us. She's the founder and managing partner of Delta Blockchain Fund. She joins us on Zoom from New York City. Kavita, big move here in Bitcoin. I'd love to get your thoughts about kind of what's really driving it here over the last, kind of 8 to 9, 10 months.
First of all, Paul and Bailey, thank you for having me. I think it's been a very interesting journey. People in the space already knew that, of course, the anticipation of Bitcoin ETF, plus the halving of Bitcoin, which is about to happen in May, starting from April, which is going to make it more difficult to produce new Bitcoins.
Okay.
So the basic principle of economics of supply and demand is going to be off, are going to trigger a lot of Bitcoin movement in a positive direction.
And to the downside, though, with the underlying risks, a lot of uncertainty from the stock market's perspective, is 50,000 a support level? Kind of what do you look at when you're seeing potential downside, just given how volatile Bitcoin historically has been, pulling back from some of these big rallies?
Yeah, and I don't think this is an all-time high. As you said, that it is a support point. The support point may go down to early 40s or mid 40s, but I doubt it's going to go down before it reaches an all-time high, or we see a crypto summer end of this year to mid of next year back to 16 or in 20s anytime soon for a year or two. I feel like there is so much of new capital because of the Bitcoin ETF, which has come into the market, multi-billion dollars, that there is now going to be a continuous demand for Bitcoin.
So, Kavita, how else? I mean, should we expect an Ethereum Bitcoin? ETF going forward? Is that kind of the next thing you guys are looking for?
Ethereum is a technology, and Ether ETF. Yes, there is a conversation going on, and why not? Because at the end of the day, ETF is the way just for the institutional investors within US to be able to hold it in a much more credible manner and to have more capital injected in it. I am personally, honestly, at this point of time, if it's just the price or the technology from both perspective, more bullish on Ether than Bitcoin. I do feel like though Ether has been going between 2.9 to 3.1K in last 2-3 days. Again, I feel like even if it goes down a little bit, we're going to see the resting price in 2. But I am more bullish on Ether as an overall technology for Ethereum.
Okay, so you're bullish Ether over Bitcoin. Where else are you seeing opportunities? It seemed like Coinbase was seen as a big winner, and a number of these other platforms and technologies, just given the approval of the ETFs that Paul mentioned.
Yeah, I think within the space, there are a lot of technologies. The other layer 2s, which I'm really bullish about, or the roll-ups, is optimism is a big one. I do see resurrection of Solana when the DeFi institution is going to happen. And a lot of DeFi, which is very similar to how the hedge funds work with USD or different currencies, the same thing with Ether, Bitcoin, and with the stable coins, we have decentralized financial products like Aave, Compound, a lot of lending protocols. I do feel like there's going to be an institutional staking around that, and that's going to really take over a lot of technology solutions. So I'm also a bit bullish on Celestia and different data layers too.
So Kavita, who are you talking to? You've got a fund, you invest in companies, you see very early stage companies out there. How broad do you think is the support out there for just crypto, blockchain? Because we still have the likes of a Jamie Dimon just giving it no love whatsoever. And I'm wondering just how deep your market is.
So you do have people like Jamie Dimon who doesn't love it and very vocal about it, but at the same time, the market continues, right? He has been vocal against it since 16 or 15, if I remember it correctly. And we didn't disappear. The market continued. It has become more strength. And I don't see a space where JP Morgan at any given point of time will not offer its clients an ETF option on Bitcoin or on Ether over time. So I do believe that the technology is here to stay. Now, what form of it is going to be there and what form of tokens going to be there, some crypto and some technology tokens, that we'll have to see within US. But one of the most interesting part about this space is it's very global. So one country, even if they have tried in the past, has not been able to really close the chapter on it. So we continues to see countries like Abu Dhabi coming up, giving licenses, or Singapore trying to be ahead of it, or countries in Europe from UK to Lisbon trying to be an amazing hub for the growth. So I just see a lot of growth in the space.
Well, Kavita, you can't talk about crypto without mentioning Binance and FTX. How do you approach investing given the fact that bulls will argue that bad actors are being flushed out, but on the flip side, it feels like that could just open up an opportunity for other people to take advantage?
So I think the game, anytime when there is finance and money and dollar involved in it, whether it's Madoff scheme or whether it's like anything out there, you are going to see scams, some sort of scams or some things which you don't have regulations and have a gray area, people really pushing beyond. So we do have FTX and Binance. And to be very honest, and I don't take away that what FTX did was completely stupid, which was very similar to Bernie Madoff's scheme. But also the lack of regulations, even though you understand the space is here to stay, you are still doing ETFs, you have companies like Coinbase going IPO, which are signed by everyone. Lack of regulations from SEC is the biggest thing which hurts and push more fear or more scams around it. And I think that's where we should focus on.
All right, very good. Kavita, thank you so much for joining us. Kavita Gupta, founder and managing partner of Delta Blockchain Fund, based here in New York, joining us via Zoom. And again, looking at Bitcoin here, 51,100 for Bitcoin. And that whole halving thing, H-A-L-V-I-N-G, basically reducing the number of new Bitcoins that can be mined, kind of just puts that a further constraint on the supply. And then that's one side of the equation. The other side of the equation, as Mike McGlone explained it to me years ago, is presumably more use cases for Bitcoin. So fixed supply, presumably higher demand, that should push the price up. That's Mike McGlone's pitch to me, which I could understand.
Yeah, I mean, that's the kind of economics, right?
Yeah.
You know, you limit supply, increase demand, prices rise. When you look at from a seasonal perspective, one thing that stands out over the last decade, two of the three best months out of the year, April and May, but Bitcoin right now up 20% in February alone.
Yep.
Absent of, which is really not is in line with big tech as it had been historically. Mm-hmm. So interesting to see how that plays out. But
and the spot, having that spot ETF is big. And I guess there were 9 ETFs that came out. So presumably that's expanding the base of investors in this
that's what bulls
asset.
Say.
Yeah, that's what the bulls say. So we'll have to see. But again, ETFs, let's do a blockchain. Let's do it. crypto ETF, and that's perfect, XBT. S&P 500 off 0.2%, NASDAQ off about 0.6%. We'll have more coming up. This is Bloomberg.
Your company news headlines on Bloomberg Radio.
From the Bloomberg Interactive Broker Studio, I'm Lisa Mateo. Today, it's all about NVIDIA, the chipmaker opening its books after the close. Now, it's responsible for a third of the NASDAQ 100 gains this year, and that has Goldman Sachs calling it the most important stock on planet Earth. Alex Webb covers tech for Bloomberg News.
I think it's important partly because of what we've seen from the other big tech stocks. It's been a little bit of a mixed picture, not uniformly good, not uniformly bad. I mean, we saw slight hiccups at Microsoft and Google, decent numbers elsewhere at Amazon and Meta. So it means there's a lot of weight on NVIDIA, which of course is responsible for a huge amount of, in fact, of the market's growth over the past year. It's gone from $600 billion market cap to $1.8 trillion in the space of a little over 12 months.
Shares are down about 2%. Now from tech to finance, HSBC, their ADRs right now, they're down about 8% after reporting fourth quarter profit that fell 80%. It also announced a $2 billion share buyback. And Citigroup boosting the pay of its CEO, Jane Fraser, by 6% to $26 million. This comes during a reorganization where thousands have lost their jobs. City's down about 0.3%. And the world's biggest e-commerce company, about to become a blue chip stock, Bloomberg's Alexandra Semenova, has more than Amazon joining the Dow Jones Industrial Average.
The e-commerce giant will replace Walgreens Boots Alliance in the 30 stock gauge. The change will go into effect prior to the open of trading on Monday, February 26th. The shift was prompted by Walmart's decision to split its stock 3-to-1. Such a move will reduce Walmart's index weight due to the price-weighted construction of the blue chip index. Unlike its counterpart in the S&P 500 and NASDAQ 100, the Dow is weighted based on the share price of its holdings rather than their market cap.
Aside from that news, we're also learning Amazon founder Jeff Bezos selling more of his stake in the company, unloading 14 million shares.
This is Bloomberg Intelligence with Alex Steele and Paul Sweeney on Bloomberg Radio.
Quick snapshot of these markets. S&P off 0.25%. The NASDAQ off 0.6%. We also keep an eye on the Russell. That's off about 0.5%. That's the small cappers. Yields just pretty much steady right here. 4.28% on your 10-year WTI crude oil. Slightly higher, $77 and change. And Bitcoin off 1.7%. 51,100 on your cryptocurrency. With our news in New York City, here's Michael Barr.
Thank you very much, Paul, Bailey, and Lisa. The U.S. has told its allies that Russia could put a nuclear weapon in space within a year. That's what sources are telling Bloomberg News. We get more from Bloomberg Government's Jonathan Tamori in Washington.
Being told U.S. allies is that Russia is trying to build a nuclear weapon in space that could target satellites and have huge disruptive effects on communications here on Earth. The President Biden has said that this weapon does not pose a threat to human lives, but obviously if you disrupt satellites, that could disrupt so much of what we do. So we depend so much on communications right now.
Bloomberg Government's John Tamari in the nation's capital. Former President Donald Trump participated in a Fox News town hall on domestic and foreign policy changes. Trump was asked to explain his Truth Social post about Russian opposition leader Alexei Navalny. He says what happened to Navalny is happening in our country.
We are turning into a communist country in many ways. And if you look at it, I'm the leading candidate. I got indicted. I never heard of being indicted before. I got indicted 4 times. I have 8 or 9 trials, all because of the fact that and you know this, all because of the fact that I'm in politics. They indicted me on things that are so ridiculous.
Meanwhile, there's news. Donald Trump's campaign spent more than it raised in January. A Trump-allied political action committee spent $2.9 million on legal fees in January alone. Separately, Trump's campaign took in $8.8 million but doled out $11.4 million last month, according to filings with the Federal Election Commission. President Joe Biden's administration announced that more than 150,000 borrowers will receive $1.2 billion in student loan forgiveness under a program unveiled in January. It seeks to provide relief for Americans who had been making payments for at least a decade. Global news 24 hours a day and whenever you want it with Bloomberg News Now. I'm Michael Barr, and this is Bloomberg. Paul, Bailey, Lisa.
Hi, Michael Barr. Thank you so much. We appreciate that. Bailey, Tom Keene and I earlier this morning on Surveillance had the CEO, Mr. Capuano of Marriott International, here in the studio talking about the company and the earnings. They put us some pretty solid earnings recently. The stock's up about 8% year to date, 45% on a trailing 12-month basis. So it was just amazing to talk to him about how his business pre-pandemic, and then it just literally half of their business went away in 2020. The revenue's cut in half, and how they dealt with that. And now how they're back above where they were pre-pandemic. What a story. And now I just noticed yesterday they went into the marketplace with a $1.5 billion debt offering. Why not? And the use of proceeds is to, maybe general corporate purposes, working capital, CapEx, all that kind of stuff, and maybe repaying some outstanding debt. So what a story he had about pre-pandemic, the depths of the pandemic, and then coming back.
Yeah, and if you look at this stock chart, it really shows that. Paul, we mentioned going to the market for $1.5 billion in debt. Company keeps just south of $13 billion in debt on their balance sheet, according to the Bloomberg terminal. Yep. So keeping that maintenance, maintaining it, always is interesting to see how different hotels and different operators in the travel and leisure space attack the debt and equity markets. Yep. And really, when you look at a business that, for lack of a better term, at least as the CEO put it, kind of booming and seeing this rebound in the U.S. and in China really does stand out.
Yeah, he was saying the leisure travel and the small business travel, they are at or above pre-pandemic levels. The large business traveler still below pre-pandemic, but that is offset a little bit by their conference business is just booming. So their conference space is sold out pretty much throughout the year. So anyway, some pretty bullish talk there from the CEO of Marriott, and the stock doing well. And he says, pretty much most of their brands, daily housekeeping is back. That was like my question, because that was kind of a thing during the pandemic. Like they didn't come. Yeah. And I was like, all right, but
want to be clean.
We'll have to see. Yeah, we'll have to see how that plays out. Anyway, good stuff there. This is Bloomberg.
This is Bloomberg Intelligence with Alex Steele and Paul Sweeney.
The real outperformance has been the U.S. corporate high yield.
Are the companies lean enough? Have they trimmed all the fat?
The semiconductor business is a really cyclical business.
Breaking market headlines and corporate news from across the globe.
Do investors like the M&A that we've seen?
These are two big-time blue-chip companies.
The window between the peak and cut changing super fast.
Bloomberg Intelligence with Alex Steele and Paul Sweeney on Bloomberg Radio.
All right, coming up in this hour, we got a lot of good stuff coming up. We're going to be busy. Thomas Notzel is going to join us. He's a Bloomberg Intelligence senior European banks analyst. HSB had some numbers, and we'll break them down with him. We'll get just a sense of how those European banks are faring overall relative to their U.S. peers. And Carol Pepper, founder and CEO of Pepper International, will join us to give us her market call. Then I think the discussion of the morning, we're saving for last. NVIDIA reporting earnings after the close today. Huge move, huge impact on the markets overall, not just the tech space. We're going to preview those numbers with none other than Gene Munster, managing partner at Deepwater Asset Management, one of the leading tech analysts out there. So that's good stuff. Right now, let's kick off this hour with the person who is just the busiest person in Bloomberg Radio, no question, Lisa Mateo. Lisa, what do you have for us?
Thank you. Good morning. Yeah, this Bloomberg Business Flash, we're brought to you by Commonwealth, supporting more than 2,000 independent financial advisors with the solutions they need to grow a thriving business. Commonwealth, go where you grow. Visit commonwealth.com to learn more. All right, we've got red on the screen right now. This is ahead of the release of the Fed's minutes from its latest meeting. Also ahead of NVIDIA results that get released after the close. The NASDAQ down about 0.5%. S&P 500 Dow is down 0.2%. Yields are higher. The 2-year yield at 4.63%, the 10-year at 4.28%, and 30-year at 4.45%. And on the commodities front, we have COMEX gold lower at $2,034 an ounce, spot gold at $2,024 an ounce, NYMEX crude $77 a barrel, Brent crude at $82 a barrel. That is your Bloomberg Business Flash. Paul and Bailey.
All right, Lisa Mateo, thank you so much. We appreciate that. Bailey Lipschultz is here with us today, sitting in for Alex Steele. She is on holiday. She'll be back on Monday. I'm Paul Sweeney. We're live here in the Bloomberg Interactive Broker Studio. We're streaming live on YouTube as well, so check us out there. Just search Bloomberg Radio and you'll find out what's happening. As Lisa was just reporting, a little bit of red on the screen today. Not going to oversell it here. Again, the market's kind of hanging out and waiting to see with NVIDIA earnings. It's strange that one company can have such an impact not only on its stock, the tech sector itself, but to a certain extent on the markets overall.
Yeah, when you look at the amount of value that NVIDIA takes up in the S&P 500, in the NASDAQ 100, in the NASDAQ composite, we're talking 4% of the S&P 500. Right. So when you have a 10% options move implied, and you're kind of not only important for the company, but also the entire AI excitement, critical results ahead.
And we'll have complete coverage of that, as only Bloomberg can give you today, again, after the close today. Nora Melinda joins us. She covers all of the equity markets for Bloomberg News. She joins us here in our New York City studio. Nora, what are you looking at?
Let's kick things off with Icon Enterprises. That is ticker IEP. And those shares are down, slumping as much as 14%, their most since August. As we know, this is Carl Icahn's investment firm. It said that the value of its assets has declined. This really has investors very apprehensive. It said that net asset value was estimated to be $4.76 billion at the end of last year, which is a $411 million decrease compared to the previous quarter. As you all probably recall, they were actually the target of a Hindenburg short report just last year, early in the year. Not sure where that stands today, but this is super interesting, especially we have them naming the new CEO, Andrew Tino. He was previously a portfolio manager at the firm, and then David Willits will now be moving as a CEO of Pep Boys.
I'm looking at this, the holders here. Icon Enterprises owns 90% of this company. So it's like, what's the liquidity here?
I remember that was the thing when Hindenburg was short, talking to some short sellers that I talked to, and they were kind of like, I mean, when you look at it, 42 out of 410 million shares are available for trading. So really, really, like you're saying, really small floats. So you have kind of weird swings.
But it does give investors exposure to or ownership in his investing. Yeah. So that's the purpose of the vehicle. Yeah. Okay, interesting. All right, what else you got for us?
Glancing back at Palo Alto Networks that we spoke about a bit earlier, those shares are plunging for a record drop of as much as 21 or 27% today. As we know, this is a software firm, more cybersecurity. It offers firewalls that identify and stop and prevent threats, ranging also to data leakages. And this is coming after the company slashed its full year forecast for both revenue and billings. It says that customers are facing spending fatigue in the cyberspace. I know, Bailey, you noted earlier, we are seeing a lot of its peers falling today.
When you look at a company that says they have spending fatigue and says this is new, and that customers are finding that incremental products are not necessarily driving a better security outcome for them, those are all kind of red flags as someone who's covered the market for a while. When you look at the CEO basically talking down the business, never really good. I did think one thing that was interesting, Nora, when you look at it, is kind of the sense, at least reading through some of the analyst notes, that the company is cutting the cost of some of these subscriptions with the expectation that it'll pay off in the long term. But does that create a price war? How does that play out in the competitive space? Right. Which, again, when you're talking tech spend and you're talking a company that says that they're trying to reinvigorate fatigue, not really good.
Not what you want to hear. No. But I did want to quickly note this thing going on with Amazon and Walgreens. Yeah. So Amazon is actually going to be joining the famous Dow Jones Industrial Average. It's going to be replacing Walgreens. We've got Walgreens shares lower this morning, and really just watching this, especially as the change is expected to go into effect prior to this next Monday, February 26th. It was all announced after market closed yesterday and was prompted by Walmart's decision to split its stock 3-1.
Yeah, we had John Farrow in earlier this morning, and notably because he has not been a fan of the Dow Jones Industrials because it's just not representative of the stock market. The names that are in the relatively few names that are in there, it's price weighted, not market cap weighted. It's some names that probably shouldn't be in there. It's how representative is it? So he never quotes it. Yeah, by policy. And if he sees it up on the board, he gets upset. So of course we invited him in to say, hey, now what do you think?
Right, it's a no from him.
Yeah, and it's still he's not buying it. So my first inclination when I heard this story this morning was, you mean they're not in the Dow Jones 30 Industrials already?
That's been the big thing, and I think the funny thing is, I thought you were going to say you asked John Farrow about whether he's a fan of Boots, being a Brit, versus Walgreens here. But when you look at the comparisons and you say, all right, Amazon's obviously a legit company, how are they not included? Then you look at Walgreens Boots, still almost a $20 billion company, but has really struggled and has been kind of clinging on to hope. So I guess to Farrow's point, if you're an index that has Walgreens Boots making up a decent chunk or really one of your 30 companies, the question is why.
Yeah, interesting. All right, Norma Linda, thank you so much. We appreciate that. As always, Norma Linda, Bloomberg News. Let's switch gears, get over to the European banking sector. I had one of the big ones today, HSBC, for those of us that have been around a while, Hong Kong and Shanghai Banking Corporation. They had some numbers, kind of disappointing today. The stock's off about 8%. Let's break it down with Tomasz Netzel. He covers all the European banks for Bloomberg Intelligence. He's based in our London office. Tomasz, tell us about HSBC here. I have the stock off about 8.5% here, so it looks like the market did not like what it heard. What's the latest on HSBC?
Yes, hey, thank you very much for having me. Well, yes, 8% is relatively big drop on the day of the results. And I think the key message we need to understand what has happened to HSBC today is not very much good clarity on revenue outlook. We had a BOCOM impairment happening for 2023 in the fourth quarter, which was more or less anticipated by the market. However, the outlook and quite murky outlook for revenue, especially after 2024, is something that analysts, I think, may be concerned about. And the same cost control is another angle that analysts would be definitely scrutinizing HSBC very closely.
And Tomasz, I'm looking at a Bloomberg story on it saying calling out the sinking profit, and when you have a number of analysts across the street saying that the quarter was messy and the guidance is unclear, as you mentioned, kind of what can investors make of it? Is this something that in the long term turns out to be a buying opportunity, or is this more of catching a falling knife?
I think, yes, good question. I think it's very important to understand what currently I think is priced in the current valuation. We talk about HSBC, which is trading at sub 6 price to earnings, below 0.8 price to book. So they're relatively cheap, right? If you look from valuation perspective. But what is pricing right now is the return story. So shareholders return. The HSBC returned $19 billion in dividends and share buybacks last year. They have capacity to repeat this in 2024. But the question is actually what will happen in 2025 with the interest income revenues. Outlook for revenue is not very clear, to be honest. During the earnings call, they introduced some new measure to look at the revenue, which is not very clear for analysts. And I think we need some time to understand exactly what are the drivers behind the revenues. If you look at the 4Q results, yes, there was a Bocom impairment, there was Argentina hyperinflation, there was Mexico a little bit higher provision, but these were one-offs. They will not be repeated in 2024. So I wouldn't draw a conclusion that there's some pressure on the earnings coming through in the next quarter. I think the bank has confirmed ROT of around 14 mid-teens ROE, which is very good as well. CET1 ratio is a healthy level, so all that looks positive. But the story of dividends and the returns is already priced in the valuation. So market is looking what's going to happen in the revenue when interest rates starting to fall in this first half of the year.
Hey, Tomasz, what's the HSBC, Hong Kong, Shanghai, so I'm assuming some good exposure there, broad exposure to China. What are they saying about the China market and kind of how they view that for their business going forward?
Well, so yes, we have seen this impairment of 3 billion on Bocoms in the stake in Bocom, but this was something that was very much anticipated after Standard Chartered did it in the third quarter. But the message from HSBC is that we are committed to the market. We believe in the economy. We believe in the rebound of the economy. We believe in the measures that have been introduced recently that will kick in the economic performance maybe this year. Recently, they've invested into wealth management business into China as well. So definitely, the fact that they have quite huge impairment on the Bocom stake, it doesn't mean they're gonna retreat from the market. I think they still believe in the market. They want to grow in the market. They see the potential over there, and I think they will stick to this as their strategy as well.
So how do investors take that? Do they? I mean, there's a lot of folks out there. They're just saying, that don't have the knowledge that obviously HSBC has or the history there. China is uninvestable. So how does HSBC kind of frame their bullishness or their commitment to China when so many other folks just see red flags?
Yeah, there are lots of red flags. I agree, and as you say, China is very much uninvestable, and the recent performance suggests so. And we look into emerging markets, and we look at emerging markets excluding China, because China is such a huge drag on EM outlook in general. But we have to understand, China is not the biggest contributor to pre-tax profit for HSBC. Right? Hong Kong is bigger, some other markets is bigger, UK, other economies, Mexico, other businesses are very big, right? So I think politically, of course, I think they are quite tight as well to China. It's very difficult to get, to leave the market, yep. And they've been in this market for quite a long time. They show commitment, and just getting out of very quickly, rapidly wouldn't look good for the bank who has been so long in this part of the world.
And Tomasz, when I look at some of the Bloomberg stories kind of calling out that they're taking an axe to global property exposure, we talk a lot about commercial real estate here in the U.S. and kind of the doldrums and uncertainty around that. How is that playing out for HSBC, again, given its exposure to Asia and to the U.K.?
Yes, of course. If you look at Asia, specifically of course China, there has been massive provisioning happening in the 2023 of around 1 billion. They have around 12 billions of commercial real estate in China booked in Hong Kong. This is very well provisioned portfolio already, so I wouldn't expect there will be massively more provision coming in 2024 unless there's another crisis with commercial real estate in China. If you look at LTVs, they're quite healthy. They're much healthier than the one in the UK. So I think UK is at around 14 billions. Deleveraging in the UK was not as fast as in Asia. Definitely, if you look at the US, in the US it was much quicker deleveraging. I think they cut exposure by almost 2 billion in 2023. and 23, and we know that US is actually the one which is causing most troubles now globally. In total, they have around 84 billions of commercial real estate, and this is the big unknown. We really don't know what's going to happen. We see lots of provisioning happening across some smaller German banks as well for US exposures. So definitely, there can be some provisioning, but I think HSBC have already done its homework, and they provision quite heavily in 2023. So 2024 could be less of a worry for them.
All right, Tomasz, you cover a broad range of European banks here. When you talk to your institutional investor clients, are they bullish on the sector? Not so much, and why?
Yeah, that's a very interesting story, because if you look at European banks, they are trading at, I think, lowest P ratios in the last 15 years, same level as we've seen in 2008, 2009 crisis. We're living in the interest rate environment, which is much more compelling and interesting for banks from interest income perspective, revenue perspective, etc. But nevertheless, there's not much. We don't see that reflected in the price and in the valuations. And there's definitely a worry around investors. What's going to happen to the commercial real estate? Is it going to be a bomb that's going to explode, and we're going to see more provisioning? There are some other components for net revenue outlook. What's going to happen with the interest rates? How quickly they're going to fall? How it's going to impact our NIMs, our margins, our net interest income? Because now we have lived for 2-3 years in a very good environment where we had rising interest rate and rising revenues. But now I think the party is over, and now clients want to understand how banks position themselves for falling interest rates, how they position themselves as well on a cost-based basis, right? Cost efficiency rates, I think right now will be something we'll be watching very closely, because we want to understand, okay, revenue are going to go down, but what's going to happen with the cost base? Are you going to trim this as well to keep the efficiency at the same level? How are we going to approach that? So there are lots of questions that investors are asking themselves to understand whether this low valuation is really very, very attractive at this time of the interest rate cycle.
Yeah, Tomasz, just again, sticking with that theme, looking at the fact that you cover emerging Europe banks, are there names under your coverage that are at risk of kind of a quarter like we saw from HSBC?
We are having Standard Chartered reporting on Friday, and I think there was a story last week that they are looking into revamping their investment banking unit within the corporate and commercial institutional banking sector. So what it means for me, I think, when I look at this is, okay, Standard Chartered is, I think, heavily looking into how to control cost base, because they see that the revenues are going to slow down. So I think that will be a very interesting story to watch, to see what they're going to do, what Bill Winter how he will address cost base, how he will address relatively low ROE prospects for the bank comparing to HSBC 15%, as Standard Chartered is around 10%. So there are definitely some measures he will have to take to reorganize the bank, to bolster the efficiency. So definitely it's something we're going to be following and watching closely. If you look at European banks, I think Deutsche Bank was an interesting case because of the commercial real estate and provisioning for the US portfolio. But as I mentioned before, this is for Deutsche Bank, it's relatively small
right.
share of their loans. So I wouldn't expect any problems there in 2024.
All right, Tomasz, great stuff. Tomasz Netzel, Senior EU Banks Analyst for Bloomberg Intelligence. He's based in our European headquarters in London, Queen Victoria Street, right next to the Bank of England. You can't get any more, downtown city of London than the Bank of England, and we're right there with him. We're going to have more coming up. This is Bloomberg.
facts, headlines, and breaking news 24 hours a day at Bloomberg.com, on Bloomberg Television, and the Bloomberg Business app. This is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
From the Bloomberg Interactive Broker Studio, I'm Lisa Mateo. Markets, well, they're in waiting mode, waiting for Fed minutes from its last meeting, waiting for NVIDIA's results after the close. Now, that has the NASDAQ down about 0.4%, but S&P, Dow right now are little changed. Yields are higher. The 2-year yield at 4.62%, the 10-year at 4.29%. And as far as currencies, we have the dollar is stronger, the Japanese yen weaker, the euro stronger, the British pound is weaker, Bitcoin at 51,011.30. That is your Bloomberg Business Flash. Paul and Bailey.
All right, Lisa Mateo, thanks so much for that. Bailey Lipschultz, he's sitting in for Alex Steele. Should be back on Monday. I'm Paul Sweeney. We're live here in our Bloomberg Interactive Broker Studio. We're streaming live on YouTube. So you go to youtube.com, search Bloomberg Radio, and that's where you will find us. Potentially a big day in the market today after the close. We get NVIDIA reporting. We'll see what it means for that stock, for the tech sector, and for the market overall. So let's just get a sense of what's happening out there in this marketplace here. Carol Pepper joins us. She's a founder and CEO of Pepper International, joining us on a Zoom call from NYC. Carol, thanks so much for joining us here. You know, I don't know if you're a tech geek or you're into this whole NVIDIA thing, but boy, it's certainly had an impact on this market. It's certainly the AI has been a big narrative for this market. How do you think about that?
Well, AI is the next large trend that people need to ride. As you know, I manage money for family offices that have greater than $100 million in net worth. So we're always looking for the important long-term trends. And when NVIDIA burst on the scene and began to support the development of AI, it became a very interesting stock. The reporting today, whether it's up or down and whether the market likes it short term, it's a long-term play. So I tell people on a fear day when NVIDIA is perhaps down a bit, even perhaps after earnings are announced, it might go down slightly for a few days. That's what happens. That's a stock to buy and hold long-term. 10 years from now, you'll be very glad you bought that security because it's really a way to start riding the trend, as is Microsoft, by the way, because Microsoft is not going to let NVIDIA take that whole market. They're starting to develop some new technology as well toward AI.
So, Carol, what else do you like in the, call it AI semiconductor space then, if buying the dip or sell-off on NVIDIA and kind of the ripple effects does play out, where else would you be looking to put money to work?
Well, I just think you want to go with a big basket if you can. So for a lot of the investors out there that aren't necessarily buying single stocks, you can look at even baskets like QQQ. There are other AI baskets that are going to be coming out very shortly. You know, I think you buy market leaders right now. So I would stick with NVIDIA for your main play on AI and Microsoft at the moment. It doesn't mean there won't be new players that are interesting coming forward. But at the moment, market leaders have continued to lead. So this has been a market where the biggest caps with the most money, whatever sector you're looking at, are leading. So don't get too cute. Buy the leaders just on a fear day when you can get in at a decent price.
All right, Carol, so you're mentioning NVIDIA, Microsoft, two of the Magnificent Seven, people wanting to call it the Fab Five is a shout out to the Michigan basketball team. What's your take on the rest of the group, just given kind of the divide that we've seen with NVIDIA really kind of carrying the baton at this point?
Yeah, well, the one I would toss out, which I think will get tossed out itself, is Tesla. Oh. I mean, I think Elon Musk is, his attention is too divided between too many things, and he's becoming a political liability. He's putting himself far out on the spectrum. So that's the one that I would toss. I don't think they're going to be a market leader 5 years from now at all, because his attention is too split and he's too troublesome. So I'd get rid of Tesla and I'd buy the others as a basket. My favorite stock for years and years has been Amazon. I think that will continue to be a strong leader. They're continuing to expand, and that they will take over the pharmacy space eventually. That's something they're trying to do, and that's a stock to watch.
Hey, Carol, you've been in this managing, the wealth of these high net worth families for decades now. How has that changed? How has that business changed? What are your clients? Are your clients today different than maybe they were 20 years ago?
Yeah, I think family offices and high net worth individuals have become extremely sophisticated over the last 20 years. Most of them have pulled the asset allocation decision and the stock selection decision inside of their own private family offices. That's what I do. I act as a CIO to the single family offices. They used to give all of those decisions to the banks, but that's like, handing the fox the keys to the hen house. They understand that banks are actually like supermarkets, and you should go shopping at a bank with a list of what you want. For example, don't let the bank tell you how much large cap growth to put in your portfolios. You tell the bank what you want, and you let them show you the products that they have. So the power balance has really changed. Now we see family offices taking control of their risk appetite, their asset allocation. They're not following every trend that comes out on the street. Suddenly Germany's going to outperform the US, or some trend will be pushed by Wall Street for a few months and then fizzle. The families aren't buying it. The families were out of China long before the general market was, because the bankers don't like to admit mistakes. So they don't pivot very quickly, but the family offices can pivot in a day and change their mind about something. So that's why they tend to be really leading investors. They're into these trends long before everybody else is, because they have no one to answer to but themselves.
And Carol, with kind of that topic in mind, how far out are you going at this point in time on the risk curve? You mentioned NVIDIA really kind of setting the tone for AI and being a long-term buying opportunity. You're focusing on some of these big tech names. Are you dabbling in putting exposure into smaller, maybe emerging technologies?
Yeah, family offices tend to look at direct, smaller plays. So we go in at the very early stage, sometimes pre-seed or seed stage, into venture capital. We don't tend to be, in the pink sheets or the small publics. Those are in difficult places. That's why you see now a lot more companies staying private and then going public with $1 billion valuation, because there's a graveyard, unfortunately, with a lot of small caps. They'll rally for a few days and then they'll die again. So we take the bets in the small companies in directs or in private equity, not so much fun, sometimes funds, but more direct, frankly, and then go for the market leaders in the market. And that's how we sort of split the risk reward scenario there on the tech side.
What do your clients ask of you as it relates to alternative investments? And if, to the extent they have that itch, how do you scratch that?
Oh, well, alternatives are a huge part of family office portfolios. Sometimes they're 30 or 40% of portfolios. Why? Because, again, family offices can go into things like venture debt. They can go into private lending. They can go into all kinds of, esoteric areas, or very specialized real estate plays in an area that they know well. So alternatives are huge for family offices, because generally there's more risk, there's less liquidity, but there's more return in alternatives, and that's something family offices can definitely handle. My family offices, I always have them have at least 2 years worth of expenses set aside in cash and money markets, earning 4 or 5%, and then we go take risk with longer term money. So they're very open and very interested in alternatives. Alternatives in real estate, funding biotechs, funding, research, genetic research. There's all sorts of very, very interesting deals that go family office to family office and never see the inside of JP Morgan or Goldman Sachs.
Carol, during my day job when I'm not hanging out with Paul, I write about the IPO market, and it still very much feels, when I talk to venture capitalist investors as well as kind of some of the crossover funds, that it is a investor-friendly market where you can walk away on valuation or pick up some of these shares of companies in the private markets at a steep discount. How are you putting money to work in the private arena, and how has that really shifted from a peak, just over 2 years ago?
Yeah, I think the private market, obviously, you can't expect a big and quick in and out right now. Markets are still very tenuous. I think they'll get less tenuous when rates come down a bit, so that financing gets easier. But things have not, people are out there trying to beat up the small companies and get in at the good valuation. And, a valuation for a company that might have been 20 million is now 5, and it's heartbreaking for the entrepreneurs. So you can pick up some discounts in that respect, because they're just people that couldn't get funded. But you still have to look for the fundamentals, which is a very strong team, a very strong, go back to Michael Porter, Competitive Advantage, Harvard Business School, read that book. It's a classic. Why is this company in existence, and why should it win? Because if there's no winning strategy, it doesn't matter how cheap you get the company, it's just going to die. Because a lot of these companies are dying now because they can't. The old model was you just live on rounds and rounds of financing until eventually you pop. That model's gone. There's less tolerance for continually refunding a company that can't earn can't make earnings unless it's led by somebody huge, like the founder of Uber or something, where that guy knows how to do it. But for new startups, you're looking for cash flow a lot earlier, and people are raising smaller rounds, so you get into you sprinkle into some small pre-seed rounds and then help the company grow is more the strategy these days, in my experience.
Gotcha. Carol, we only have about 30 seconds left. One of the stocks we talked about at the top of the show, Palo Alto Networks, down 26%. This is a big cybersecurity play. Are those the type of sell-offs that you would look to buy?
Absolutely. I don't happen to know that company very well, but yes. I mean, the market swings a lot. So you should have your favorite names, know why you like them, know how they're going to fit into your portfolio and what size you want, and then wait for the fear day. There'll be a fear day for NVIDIA too. Even though it's so high, people have said to me, I can't get in. People were saying that about Amazon 10 years ago. Oh, it's too high, I can't get in. So those value guys miss the entire run. So just, hold your breath, hold your nose, and get in on a fear day to the stocks that you're interested in. And by the way, cybersecurity long-term is a very important play and trend.
Right.
That need is not going away.
All right, Carol, thank you so much for your time. Really appreciate it. Carol Pepper, President and Founder and CEO of Pepper International, joining us via that Zoom thing from New York City. I appreciate getting a few minutes of her time. S&P 500 off about 0.2% here. The NASDAQ off about 0.5% here. Not going to oversell it. I'm going to call out the VIX for Tom Keene, 15.5. With our news in New York City, here's Michael Barr.
Thank you very much, Paul, Bailey, and Lisa. The European Union approved a modest new package of sanctions ahead of the 2-year mark since Russia invaded Ukraine and following the death of opposition leader Alexei Navalny in a Russian prison. Meanwhile, the White House says it's preparing additional major sanctions to hold Russia accountable for the death of the Putin critic. Donald Trump is doubling down on comparing his criminal indictments to the circumstances of Navalny. Trump held a town hall with Fox News last night in which he suggested he also could become a political prisoner.
I got indicted 4 times. I have 8 or 9 trials, all because of the fact that and you know this, all because of the fact that I'm in politics. They indicted me on things that are so ridiculous.
The former president, however, never condemned Putin for Navalny's death. New York Attorney General Letitia James says that she is prepared to seize Donald Trump's assets if he does not come up with a $355 million fine for a judge that ordered him to pay as punishment for a decade of fraud. Trump insisted the banks liked doing business with him and said there was no victim.
Financial frauds are not victimless crimes. He engaged in this massive amount of fraud, and it wasn't just a simple mistake, a slight oversight. The variations were wildly exaggerated, and the extent of the fraud was staggering.
Trump said the penalty against him would drive other businesses out of New York. American government lawyers say that WikiLeaks founder Julian Assange should face espionage charges in the U.S. because he put innocent lives at risk and went beyond journalism in his bid to solicit, steal, and indiscriminately publish classified U.S. government documents. U.S. lawyers are at Britain's High Court. Global news 24 hours a day and whenever you want it with Bloomberg News Now. I'm Michael Barr, and this is Bloomberg.
headlines, and breaking news 24 hours a day at Bloomberg.com, on Bloomberg Television, and the Bloomberg Business app. This is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
From the Bloomberg Interactive Broker Studio, I'm Lisa Mateo. A pretty slow start on Wall Street right now. We have the Nasdaq down about 0.5%, the Dow, S&P right now down about 0.1%. And NVIDIA has a lot to do with those tech losses. After it reports, after the bell, some high expectations there for NVIDIA. We shall see what happens after the close when they open their books. Traders also sifting through minutes from the Fed's last meeting, looking for any clues as to the central bank's next steps. We also had Fed Bank Richmond President Thomas Barkin. He said recent economic data, it showed how price pressures in some sectors, they're just still too high, despite those improvements in overall inflation. Yields are higher. The 2-year yield at 4.63%, the 10-year at 4.29%. And on the commodities front, we have COMEX gold lower at $2,035 an ounce, spot gold at $2,024 an ounce, and oil, NYMEX crude $77 a barrel, Brent crude $82 a barrel. That is your Bloomberg Business Flash. Paul and Bailey.
All right, Lisa Mateo, thank you so much. We appreciate it. Bailey Lipschultz, Paul Sweeney here in our Bloomberg Interactive Broker Studio. Bailey, you know it's bad when your cab driver says, are you going to be listening to the NVIDIA call today?
No way.
I mean, this is going to be this thing. So the implied volatility, which you showed me from the Bloomberg terminal, is 10%. And for a company with 1.7 trillion market cap, that could be some shekels gained and lost here coming up. So Gene Munster joins us because we have to get the bottom line here, and Gene can certainly do that. Gene Munster, he's a managing partner, co-founder of Deepwater Asset Management. He's been all over the tech space for decades. Hey, Gene, have you ever seen anything like this where a company has not only a big impact, I guess, on itself, but even in its sector, but also kind of the broader market mentality? NVIDIA is really outsized, isn't it?
Absolutely. Answer your question, I've maybe seen it back when the iPhone was starting to get going. It had an outsized impact on overall tech, but if you put that into perspective, that was iPhone 16 years ago, so it's been a long time. When you think about the transformation of AI, it's understandable that NVIDIA's gotten the attention and the expanding market cap that it's had over the past year, because, of course, it is in a pole position. It is benefiting tremendously from this AI infrastructure. That, of course, is all in the rearview mirror, and it's all about looking forward. But to answer your question, this is pretty special times we're in. One just final thought. Outside of their earnings here, if I look back over the past year and look what's happened to NVIDIA relative to expectations, how they've beat expectations, what they've done to guidance, that period, those 3 quarters, that's something I have never seen. Multi-billion to 30, 40, 50%, guiding up by 20%, and then beating that upward guide by another 30, 40%. It is simply breathtaking from a tech investor's perspective.
Yeah, folks, and what you just heard is really has some gravitas because Gene's been investing and analyzing tech companies for decades here. He's seen them from the cradle to the grave, so that means something. 1.7 trillion market cap company here, stocks up 230% over the trailing 12 months. So, Gene, that tells me, boy, the bar is extraordinarily high here. What's a win for this company? What's a loss for this company here after the close?
I don't know what the stock's going to do tomorrow. It's hard, really, when you see that kind of volatility built on the options. That means there's a lot of jockeying beyond what's going on with kind of fundamental investors. So anything can happen. The stock could be up big on the print and could fade tomorrow. The opposite could happen too. From my perspective, what is most important is understanding how the commentary for the company is going to impact calendar 25 revenue growth. And just to kind of put this in a quick perspective, the company is going to grow this quarter at around 250% year over year. The growth expectations for calendar 24 is 64%, a pretty big slowdown because of the law of large numbers. And then another big slowdown in 25, down to 17%. And so effectively, investors recognize this company has been through just a breathtaking growth period here. But the general consensus is that the business is going to hit the wall. And even if you look at the valuation right now, it's actually a pretty reasonable valuation. It trades essentially in line with its earnings growth expectations for 25. So to answer your questions, what I'm looking for tonight is for CFO Jensen Huang just to reiterate what he has said related to where we are within AI. And just to briefly recap that, he has these 4 talking points. He talks about these 4 waves of AI. And the current phase that we're just starting in is AI infrastructure. That's the hyperscalers. That's AI startups. Phase 2 is enterprise applications. That would be like Copilot. Phase 3 is going to be heavy industry getting generative AI. And he said that is the largest opportunity. Phase 4 is sovereign nations. I mean, there's a lot here. So my bottom line is that if investors ultimately walk away from this quarter, tomorrow, tonight, next week, and say we're still very early in this and NVIDIA's got a great pole position, then those expectations for calendar 25 probably start moving higher, which is ultimately going to be positive for the stock.
And Gene, when we look at it from a valuation standpoint, about 30 times 2025 EPS, when you look at what the path forward that you're mentioning for NVIDIA looks like, is it just continuing to grow the AI pie, if you will, or is it being able to fend off would-be rivals?
Well, I think that just the pie, the TAM expansion, I mean, this has been one of the talking points from AMD. If you look at what they've said at their Analyst Day last fall versus what they've said a month ago, they've basically said that their addressable market would 4x, and then that was 3-4 months ago, and a month ago they said it would 2x from that 4x. I mean, these are just, it's mind-boggling kind of how fast these numbers are going up. And the reason why they're saying that is they're seeing the order flow. And so ultimately, NVIDIA's got an amazing product. They've got a product cycle coming up. They have basically a code and operating system that works around what these chips do. It's a developer platform. That's a better way to say it. So, but if they've got such high market share right now, 85% in the GPU market, it's really about continuing to expand the TAM. And I think that that's ultimately going to happen. I mean, I'm in the camp that AI is going to be more transformative, twice as transformative what the internet has been, which is hard to wrap your head around that. But I think that there's NVIDIA is just in a great position relative to that opportunity.
Well, you know, Gene, one of my questions is, you know, just as a layperson here as it relates to tech spending, how much of this tech spending associated with AI do you believe is incremental versus maybe just shifting it around from other budgets here?
The most commentary we've heard is from those big tech companies. Those are the hyperscalers. That's the companies like Google and Meta, Microsoft. Apple hasn't said as much, but they're going to get more into this. But what they've shared is that it is incremental. They've talked about, you know, their typical run rate of CapEx. Let's just call that at a typical growth rate of 10, 15% a year. And those growth rates, the spending in CapEx is going to go up, call it 25, 30%. This is an average if you look at some of those big companies. So this is incremental. I mean, they're seeing this as you have to pay to play to invest in the future. And so I think it is incremental. When you kind of process, like go through the theory of this incremental spend, that's how you get expanding addressable markets, is when you get that incremental spend. When things are shuffling around, it's hard to get those expanding markets. But in this case, I think it is true. This is just a whole new infrastructure that's being built largely on GPUs versus the old infrastructure on CPUs, and that is incremental spend.
And Gene, as we've seen the valuation skyrocket and it's leaping above a number of well-known names, the Metas and the Berkshires of the world, can it catch Microsoft? Microsoft at just south of $3 trillion in market value compared to NVIDIA's 1.7?
I think the AI opportunity is big enough that it can catch that. I mean, if in fact I'm right, and I mean our firm, this is a firm, Deepwater, our firm believes that this is, you know, 99 out of a scale of 0 to 100 is AI. Electricity is 100. It's that close, and the internet's 50. If that's true, yes, there continues to be this upside to. I don't want to get carried away, by the way, in the moment of kind of the hype. I'm just trying to step back, and again, I don't know what the stock's going to do tomorrow, but I do have a sense about how impactful AI is ultimately going to be. And so what is that kind of that high end of market cap expansion? When I was talking about that fourth point, sovereign nations, this is countries needing to have their own AI to really reflect their intelligence and their culture. I mean, these are some pretty bold and big objectives that these very deep pockets are going after. And when you think about that relative to the market cap, you can build a case that it can go much higher.
Gene, thanks so much again. Always appreciate getting your time. Gene Munster, Managing Partner and Co-Founder of Deepwater Asset Management, NVIDIA. After the close, Gene Munster, one of the best voice coming out of the Valley. This is it.
Your company news headlines on Bloomberg Radio.
From the Bloomberg Interactive Broker Studio, I'm Lisa Mateo. All eyes on NVIDIA today. The AI chip giant reports earnings after the close. It's now the third most valuable company in the U.S. Mandeep Singh is with Bloomberg Intelligence.
Anytime you see headlines like NVIDIA surpassing Alphabet or Amazon in market cap, you have to ask yourself, what is the fundamental business that NVIDIA is in versus all these other giants, which have, if you look at the sum of the parts valuation, they've got multiple businesses. So really expectations are getting ahead of themselves, and there will be a point where it will be hard to just manage expectations. And I think NVIDIA probably is at that point.
Shares are down about 2%. Cybersecurity company Palo Alto Networks, they cut its annual revenue forecast, and that has shares really getting bid up. They're down about 26%. Cisco Systems, they plan to borrow from the U.S. high-grade bond market to partly finance its proposed $28 billion acquisition of Splunk. Now, its shares are down. Well, they're a little changed right now. And Ford, they're slashing prices of its electric Mustang. Sales fell 51% in January when those tax incentives were taken out. Bloomberg Detroit Bureau Chief David Welch, he says loosening rules and regulations around EVs, that could help, but don't expect lawmakers to do that.
There was such a big fight to get all of these different incentives approved. And there was very much a desire by Senator Manchin and a lot of Republicans to make sure that these incentives didn't just help China continue to grow its EV supply chain. And I just don't see the flexibility coming in because it was such a battle to get this approved in the first place.
Now, Ford is down about 0.8%. And deal-making news, Thoma Bravo weighing a sale of J.D. Power for about $8 billion. This is Bloomberg.
This is Bloomberg Intelligence with Alex Steele and Paul Sweeney on Bloomberg Radio.
All right, a quick data check here. The markets are pretty calm here. The S&P and the Dow off about 0.1%. The Nasdaq's off about 0.5%. Volume's a little bit light here. Maybe people are just waiting for those NVIDIA earnings, which could have a big impact on the market. We'll see. Yields slightly higher. The 10-year Treasury 4.28%. WTI crude oil up about 50 cents. $77.50 per barrel for WTI crude oil. With our news in New York City, here's Michael Barr.
Thank you very much, Paul, Bailey, and Lisa. Breaking news, the University of Alabama at Birmingham has paused IVF treatments as it examines a ruling by the state Supreme Court that determined that frozen embryos should be considered children. The spokesperson for the university says, while we are saddened, we must evaluate the potential that our patients and our physicians could be prosecuted criminally. The Alabama Supreme Court ruling could leave those who destroy frozen embryos liable for wrongful death. The Biden administration is rolling out another round of student debt relief worth about $1.2 billion. More from Bloomberg Government's Jonathan Tamari in Washington.
This one will affect somewhere around 150,000 people. In all, the White House says they've given relief to 3.9 million borrowers. But that is a lot less than they originally hoped for. Their original plans were blocked by the Supreme Court. As you look to this election year for President Biden, this was a major promise he made. This was something really important to a lot of younger voters who supported him. They've really, in polling, fallen away from Biden. So this may be one of his last kind of chances to try to bring them on board and show that he's done something for them.
Bloomberg Government's Jonathan Tamari. Former President Donald Trump's campaign spent more than it took in last month. According to the Federal Election Commission, Trump's campaign took in $8.8 million, but doled out $11.4 million in January. The Trump-allied Political Action Committee spent $2.9 million on legal fees in January alone. Some scary moments on board an American Airlines flight from Albuquerque, New Mexico to Chicago when passengers say a man sitting at an emergency exit tried to open the plane door mid-flight. Several passengers wrestled the man down.
When I grabbed him, like, he turned around, he gave me this look like, "Excuse me, sir, what the hell do you think you're doing?" Like, I had just picked up his drink at the bar. There was just this, it wasn't a total lack of connection, but I mean, there was just something wrong.
The flight returned to Albuquerque, where the man was taken into custody. Global news 24 hours a day and whenever you want it. With Bloomberg News Now, I'm Michael Barr. This is Bloomberg. Paul?
All right, Michael Barr, thank you so much. We appreciate that. Boy, what a treat this week. We got Joe Matthew in New York. Finally broke away from Washington, D.C. Balance of Power comes up in just moments with Joe Matthew. Joe, thanks for joining us in the studio here. Where do you guys go every day with your show? I mean,
That's a great question.
There's so much going on down in D.C. What's the topic du jour at this point?
Well, it's I think the story that we're not talking enough about is something we got to a little bit earlier, and that's whether the government's going to shut down when lawmakers come back. We've spent so much time talking about the border and Ukraine that this little thing about funding the government has sort of fallen through the cracks here, and lawmakers are gone. That's why I'm up here hanging out with you. They decided to take a 2-week recess,
Must be
knowing
nice.
that they would have 3 days left when they got back to finish this. Let's go home, everybody. And so I'm not sure how we're going to avoid it.
So, I mean, I don't know. Just to this layperson, the Republicans control the House. If the House doesn't get something done, don't they take the blame for that? And what's a political calculus?
That's frequently how that works,
That's
yes.
how that works.
And you've got a speaker now with a essentially a two-seat spread here, which means it's going to be really hard to get anything done. Do you see he was at Mar-a-Lago over the weekend taking pictures with Donald Trump?
Good with him. Good for him.
And a lot of folks are referring to Donald Trump as the Speaker of the House
Yes,
at this point.
right. Okay. Well,
Kind of.
there's a good golf course down there, as I understand it. All right, Balance of Power coming up in just moments with Joe Matthew and his team. They will break down all of the activity and the shenanigans down in Washington, D.C. We're going to just keep a focus on these markets here. Just a little bit of red on the screen, not going to oversell it here. But again, the market, the big potentially market-moving item will be NVIDIA earnings after the close. It's got a big impact on tech and maybe other industries as well, maybe the market in general. So we'll bring that to you, of course, after the close. This is Bloomberg.
From the world of politics to the world of business, this is Balance of Power. Live from Washington, D.C.
Republicans prepare to give up the ghost on a government shutdown. Welcome to the fastest show in politics as House leaders wrap their annual retreat in Florida with expectations for, yes, a shutdown that could begin just over 2 weeks. We're going to get the latest from Jack Fitzpatrick at Bloomberg Government. He's got his finger on the pulse on Capitol Hill. Nikki Haley may be down on the polls, but she just outraised Donald Trump for the first time. We'll get into the campaign ahead with Patrick Murray, director of the Monmouth University Polling Institute. And as Donald Trump floats his VP shortlist, a lot of familiar names here. We'll have analysis from our panel. Bloomberg Politics contributor Jeannie Shanzano is with us, along with Chapin Fay, Republican strategist at Actum. And it's all after a look at Wall Street. Let's get to trading right now with the man, Charlie Pellet. Hey, Charlie.
Hi, thank you very much, Joe Matthew. All about NVIDIA. Yeah, we got the Fed minutes coming up 2 o'clock Wall Street time, but the big focus is on what happens with NVIDIA after the close of trading. Right to the numbers, because we got NVIDIA down now by 2.1% ahead of earnings. Right now, NVIDIA's at $679.89. Not the only company reporting today after the bell. We'll also be hearing from Analog Devices. That stock higher now by 2%. And another tech name after the bell today, Synopsys. But yes, the major focus will be on NVIDIA, with the stock now down by just about 2.1%. Ivan Feinseth is a technology analyst with Tigris Financial, and he was interviewed this morning about NVIDIA on surveillance.
You know, the stock has become, the major focus of the market. So everybody's waiting to see what the results are, to see if they can continue to grow at this rapid pace and how it will continue to power so many other companies.
And you can hear more of the conversation on the Surveillance podcast. You can download it wherever you get your podcast. S&P right now lower by 8, down 0.1%. Tech leading the way lower. We've got NASDAQ at 15,550, down 80 points right now, drop there of 0.5%. Dow Industrials down 70 points, down 70, a drop there of 0.2%. 10-year at 4.30%, with a 2-year now 4.64%. Spot gold is lower now, little change, down $1 the ounce to 2023. West Texas Intermediate crude up 1%, 77.84 a barrel. So again, recapping, NVIDIA lower ahead of earnings. NVIDIA down 2.3%. S&P down now by 0.2%. Balance of Power continues. Once again, here he is, your host, Joe Matthew.
Thank you, Charlie Pellet. Great to see you, and welcome to the Wednesday edition of Balance of Power. I'm Joe Matthew at Bloomberg World Headquarters in New York. We, of course, have a constant connection to what's happening in the nation's capital, where most people are gone, lawmakers on recess, and as we told you, Republican leaders holding forth the big confab in Miami at the Mandarin Oriental, where the real deals are made, their annual leadership retreat over the weekend, and generating some news. Guys like Bob Good on the Freedom Caucus are saying it out loud. Reports suggest that guys like the Speaker of the House, Mike Johnson, are saying it quietly behind closed doors. The government's going to start shutting down pretty soon, the 1st of March. There's no plan to avoid that. That could change, of course, with a full shutdown kicking in on the 8th of March. If you listen to this program, you know the score here. Lawmakers will have only 3 days to manage this when they get back, and that's why folks like Jack Fitzpatrick at Bloomberg Government are scratching their head right now to figure out if there is really a path. And Jack joins us as we speak. The reporting today, Jack, when you read the tip sheets, when you read the terminal, would suggest that this might be unavoidable. What's your view?
It's not unavoidable yet. I'm not hearing absolute alarm bells and just straight up warnings that there will be a shutdown, but there are a few really tough issues. One just being the calendar, the fact that the first 4 of
from the UK, and I'm the inventor of the gel razor. And today I'm looking for an angel investor to fund my project, the gel razor, whether that's a working concept and working prototype, or manufacturing possibilities with investment, or to get me a licensing deal secured. If you go in any supermarket today, you will see packets of razors sold separately with tins of mousse or gel. Hence I developed the all-in-one. The idea is you pressurise the handle, the gel flows through the reservoir up to the head of the razor, coating the blades, ready for shave. My target market is 18 plus, male or female, male blue version, female pink version. What I'm looking for in an investor is someone who's passionate, determined, shares my vision. That's an important step for me, and willing to succeed as I want it to succeed myself. Patented in the UK in 2021 September with copyright protection. I have a logo for the gel razor, which you will see on my LinkedIn profile. Currently working with a company in the US who have done me a lovely sell sheet. Big up to them guys. So if you're interested, contact me on LinkedIn profile, Paul J. Gwilt, GWILT, or email me at mufc219@gmail.com.
Layer, another dimension to the negotiations. They have not figured out exactly how they're going to package these, though I've asked a number of lawmakers, is it going to be a 4-bill package followed by an 8-bill package?
Okay, today I'm going to talk about how to succeed with a startup. Obviously, more than can be said here in 20 minutes, but I will do the best I can. The most important thing, the number one lesson we try to teach startups is that the degree to which you're successful approximates the degree to which you build a product that is so good, people spontaneously tell their friends about it. Startups always ask us for the secret to success. They always want to believe it's something other than this, because this is really hard to do. But this is it. If you can build a product that is so good, people spontaneously tell their friends about it, you have done 80% of the work that you need to be a really successful startup. If you think about the most successful companies you know, Google, Facebook, whatever, you probably found out about them because a friend of yours said, you got to try this, it's great. So this is the bar. Something that people love so much they tell their friends about it. One important indicator for a product like that is a product that's simple to explain and easy to understand. If you can't explain in a few words what you do, and if at least some people don't say, oh, that's pretty interesting, that's usually a mistake. It's usually a sign of unclear thinking or a need that is not big enough.
He does do something on Ukraine aid without a grand deal on immigration. But since there are some centrists pushing for a vote on at least limited measures, you look to Representative Gottheimer. I spoke briefly to Representative Golden, Jared Golden from Maine, who said he wants to talk to the speaker about that kind of scenario. There may be Democratic help coming depending on exactly what the deal is. There are not a ton of Democrats who want to broadcast that they would vote for a Republican or sit out a vote, but it is potentially on the table.
All right, Jack Fitzpatrick, thank you, sir. As always, reporting for Bloomberg Government. Make sure to subscribe to Jack's newsletter, by the way, on budget at the terminal and at Bloomberg.com. I'm Joe Matthew at World Headquarters in New York. When you consider the lack of action, I mean, I don't know if any of that made sense to you, but it does seem that we're careening toward a likely shutdown. And even if we're not, a standoff potentially between Speaker Johnson and his own Republican conference, depending on the lever he chooses to pull here. And we want to continue the conversation with Patrick Murray. He's joining us from Monmouth University's Polling Institute, where he is the director of operations. Patrick, it's great to see you. We tend to ask you about presidential favorability, approval ratings, and the horse race on the campaign trail, which I will ask you about. But how's Congress doing these days? We talk so much about Joe Biden's approval rating. Are we in the single digits? Where's Congress in terms of Americans' views of what they're getting done?
Yeah, well, we're not quite at the single digits, but we're getting close. 14% of Americans approve of the job that Congress is doing. 79% disapprove. And while we've seen numbers that are very close to that before, that 79% number is the highest that we've seen since we started polling nationally back in 2013. So there's a record high for congressional disapproval right now.
A record high. I guess there's always room for new records here, Patrick.
You think. We're getting pretty close to where you can't get them anymore.
But that's actually very true. When you play them against Joe Biden's approval numbers, it starts to put things in context here a little bit. America is sick of Washington, period.
Yeah, I mean, Joe Biden's numbers are in the high 30s to 40%. In most polls, it was 38 in our poll. But Congress, those numbers have just been, for the last decade, have just been bad. Even if I think that we've seen them as high as 35, closing in on 40%. But they have been in the 20s for most of the past decade. And that's because of we were just talking about it. Congress is broken. They can't get together on big ticket items. Is that they're looking to protect their flanks, and that trickles down. That's part of the problem that we've seen in our polling all along, is that people say they want bipartisanship. We've asked them some questions about this. They always say they want bipartisanship. But in the end, I think some of these leaders know that you have to play to your wings, the extremes of your wings if you're going to get reelected in a potentially contested primary, and that's what it seems all about. So then, in the end, Congress is broken, and it's reflected in these poll results that we get.
Well, I'll tell you, for Joe Biden, it's got to be a head scratcher for the administration. We spend so much time here talking about stronger than expected economic data recently, whether it's the job market, whether it's overall economic growth by way of GDP, whether it's prices. That's another problem here, of course, with inflation being a little hotter than expected at the beginning of this year. And you found just a third of Americans, 1/3, feel they're benefiting from this current economy. It's not likely to get a lot better between now and the election, Patrick.
And that's one of the things that I've been explaining to folks over the past few years, is that this inflation factor is something that we haven't dealt with for basically a generation. So we've asked the same question about the growing economy, and it includes a couple of things that hadn't happened during the pandemic, such as high Dow Jones average and low unemployment and so forth. But now we're back to that situation. So we were asking the same question that we asked before the pandemic. And Joe Biden does a lot worse than his two predecessors on this mark. As you mentioned, 33% say they're getting some benefit from this growing economy. 40% say they're not getting any benefit at all. And, if you look at Trump and if you look at Obama, when we asked the question during their terms, it was only about a quarter of Americans who said that they weren't getting any benefit from the growing economy then.
Okay.
And I think the difference that we have with Joe Biden is that the numbers were better in past administrations because it was coming off a pretty consistent boom with just some roadblocks or road bumps along the way. With Joe Biden, this inflation factor is significantly different than what his predecessors had faced. And this is the thing that keeps people from saying, yeah, the economy is booming, but I'm still paying 20% more for my groceries than I did 4 years ago. And that's really what's holding it back.
Even if you're making more than you were 4 years ago, even if you're making more than inflation, which is really interesting to me here. Patrick, this is very difficult to quantify. People want the same grocery bill they had in 2019 before COVID. And talk about some tough comparisons there. In this case, coming out of COVID, my goodness, it's been a surge when you look at the job market and so forth. But the fact of the matter is, in many cases, their wages have not only kept up with, but topped inflation. The White House cannot seem to connect with people on this.
Yeah, this is like a key thing where they just simply cannot, get. Basically, it is just there's that benchmark. It's that 2019 grocery bill benchmark, and you can't get away from it. And even if we just talk in general about the growing economy, and we ask people, how much credit does Joe Biden, even if you're not getting benefit, how much credit does Joe Biden get for the fact that these other factors are doing better than they were before? And only about half will give him, at least grudgingly, some credit for that. So he can't even get credit for the things that are happening elsewhere in the economy.
Well, that's true. As we spend time with Patrick Murray from Monmouth University, important headline from this White House is the president has wrestled with the idea of student loan debt forgiveness. His administration announcing more than 150,000 borrowers will receive $1.2 billion in student loan forgiveness under this program unveiled in January, seeking to provide relief. Does this move the needle here, or these are not the folks the president needs to worry about?
Yeah, this is really geared, if you're just looking at it in terms of its political impact in a presidential election year. This is geared towards some base Democratic voters that have drifted away from Joe Biden. These are particularly lower income voters of color, black voters, Hispanic voters, because they're the ones who are impacted significantly more by that student loan debt in terms of their overall debt and their economic well-being.
As you find, though, in your research, that when it comes to helping poor families, Biden does better than Trump, but much worse than Obama. How come?
Yeah, and I get it. It's just this simple sense that in big boom times with Obama, that the rising tide raises all boats, I think, was kind of this sense. And it's not here. And it's interesting, that student loan thing, because when we ask about student loans, majority of voters overall are against, including Democrats, are against relieving all debt, because there's a sense that you entered that debt. But it's different among black voters. It's different among Hispanic voters. And that's a core group that Biden needs to get back on his side. He still has a majority of them supporting him, but nowhere near the 2/3 or more majority that he had in 2020.
Patrick, we started our conversation talking about Congress, woeful approval ratings. If we have a shutdown, I suspect that this polls pretty consistently when you're looking at blame game and what people think of Congress. Would that be something Republicans should worry about, or both parties?
I think, in the end, it's both parties should worry about it. The Republicans maybe a little bit more, because, we've seen this game play out a little bit as partisan voters get more entrenched in just supporting one side or the other. It doesn't matter to them what happens. They'll blame the other side.
Yeah, sure.
But there still is a core group of voters. They're small, but they're going to be decisive in a high turnout election where a lot of these margins are going to be very thin, both for the president and the Electoral College in some key states, but also for some members of Congress up for re-election, where this sense that Congress is broken, those voters are voters who are unhappy with a focus on social issues like abortion. They want to go back to bread and butter issues. What are you doing on taxes? What are you doing on the economy? And this kind of sense that you can't even keep the government open will probably, on the margins, have more of a negative impact on Republicans and Democrats.
Patrick Murray, you have the best background on the show so far today. If you were with us on YouTube, you'd see my favorite Richard Nixon poster behind him there. It's great to see you, Patrick. Come back and see you soon. From Monmouth University, he's the director of the Polling Institute. A deep dive, a great clinic with Patrick here on the fastest show in politics. This is Bloomberg.
12:21 on Wall Street. We do check markets all day long here at Bloomberg. We have got the Dow, the S&P, NASDAQ all in the red. Right now we've got the S&P bouncing off the lows of the day with a loss of 13 points, down by about 0.3%. The S&P right now at 49.62, again down 0.3%. Dow Industrials now lower by 0.2%. The Dow down 72 points. NASDAQ hard hit, down 122 points right now for the NASDAQ Composite Index, a drop there of 0.8%. All about earnings, specifically all about NVIDIA. That is the stock du jour, with NVIDIA now down 3.8% ahead of earnings after the bell. The giant chip maker is at the very heart of the AI frenzy that has powered the bull market. Again, NVIDIA shares lower by 3.7%. 10-year at 4.30%, the 2-year 4.64%. Spot gold right now trading lower by 0.1%. Little change. West Texas Intermediate crude up 1% right now, 77.84 for a barrel of WTI. Amazon shares higher, up by 0.4%. Amazon finally joining the Dow Jones Industrial Average, replacing shares of Walgreens Boots Alliance. Also today we learned that Uber is going to be added to the Dow Transports. Uber down 0.4%. Uber will be replacing JetBlue. JetBlue shares down 2.6%. Recapping stocks lower, with the S&P down 13, down 0.3%. Balance of power continues. Once again, here's your host in New York. We're lucky to have him, Joe Matthew.
Charlie, we thank you. Welcome to the fastest show in politics. You know, you're at Bloomberg when the politics guy is worried about NVIDIA. Charlie, what's going to happen here when this report, I mean, is the building going to shake tonight? I'm kind of scared about what happens after 4.
Well, I tell you, we on the staff are going to be all over this when this number breaks. And it's really become sort of a poster child for artificial intelligence.
Well, yeah.
And it'll be interpreted very, very, very closely, and likely will take a bunch of other tech stocks with it, either up, down, or sideways. And, you know, I heard you talking a little earlier to Bailey Lipschultz, asking the question, what happens if they beat?
Yeah, right.
And
that was off the air.
I get the impression it was off air, but you know what? It never stopped me from putting our off air conversations on the air.
I love that. Thank you.
but it does raise the question: what happens then? And you know, it's like being in college. You score an A+, and your parents say that's not good enough. So
that's correct.
Stay tuned.
Wow, I feel bad, guys. You've got a college kid too. Yeah, this is going to be interesting. I'll just have to hold on to something, I guess, when this is released after 4 o'clock. So in the meantime, everyone's on the campaign death watch here for Nikki Haley, right? The whole question every day since New Hampshire is, well, is she going to stay in the race? When is she dropping out of the race? Does she go through New Hampshire? Does she go through South Carolina? What if she's embarrassed? Well, take a look at the fundraising numbers that were released. The deadline was last night. Maybe we're not dropping out anytime soon, because guess what? Nikki Haley outraised Donald Trump for the first time. We're looking at January numbers here, and it looks pretty good for the Haley campaign. The question is, I guess, will it matter? And that's where we bring in Wendy Benjaminson. Let's go back to Washington and find Bloomberg's senior Washington editor. It's great to see you, Wendy. I wonder your thoughts when we pick through the numbers here. Both Joe Biden and Nikki Haley are outraising Donald Trump. Should that tell us something?
Well, it tells us that there's a lot of people with money behind Nikki Haley. We've known this. She is banking literally on Wall Street and other banking industry donors to keep her campaign alive. The trouble is it's not translating into Republican primary votes. Mm-hmm. So, yes, she has tenacity. And as one sort of political watcher said, you know, tenacity is a good quality in a president. Yes, but to be president, she has to be elected. She is going to stay in the race, she says, through at least Super Tuesday, which is early March. She is going to face what to other politicians could be a humiliating loss Saturday in her own home state where she was the governor, and Trump is outpolling her 2-1. And then she'll try for Super Tuesday. The trouble is these primaries also give you delegates that you take to the convention and become the nominee with. And he has more than she does. So even though she may have more cash than he does, he's got more delegates.
He's got more delegates, and he's the king of earned media, right, as we say, and hasn't been spending a lot of money in South Carolina because apparently, Wendy, he doesn't need to. As we learned as well, his leadership PAC, Save America, had to spend another almost $3 million on legal expenses last month.
Right.
So he
yeah,
better
he's
keep
spending all
raising
that money on lawyers.
Yeah.
Yeah. Right. And that money right now will run out. The lawyers, you know, it's expensive, right? Criminal lawyers are expensive, civil lawyers are expensive, and that money that he has that he can legally use to pay the lawyers will run out mid-year. So he will be trying, obviously, to raise more of that from those sources, because honestly, you know, keeping the lawyers happy is almost more important to his future right now than running in a race he's already winning.
That's quite a statement. Meanwhile, Joe Biden is a cash machine. He's going to have quite a war chest when this really gets to be a general election spending contest.
Right.
It's been impressive. He's spending the week on the West Coast, or most of it, raising money. He's got a lot more to raise here, Wendy. Does he know how to use it in a campaign against Donald Trump? It's going to be a lot different than last time around.
It is going to be a lot different this time around. He is talking about spending even more time talking about what he sees as Donald Trump's failings, both personal and professional, through the campaign. He'll be advertising on that. But, you know, what our polling and other polling is showing is that voters really want to hear about the future. Okay, you are going to run for president. Again, you are, this is Joe Biden I'm talking about, you are 81 years old. You're talking a lot about the past. Talk about the future. And there are some who are even advocating him to use the bully pulpit of the Oval Office to go out and really push in a nationally televised speech for the aid to Ukraine, which House Republicans are blocking. And, you know, he really wants it. So they're saying, so, you know, use your power to speak, because when he does speak, people do actually listen to him.
Those calls continue to come in, and it's a venue that he is underused. Wendy, you wonder if we're in for a speech at some point, an address to the nation at some point soon on that matter. Of course, he's got a State of the Union right around the corner as well. I'm just picking through some of these filings, though. Look at RFK Jr., $2.7 million. He spent $3.2 million. Is he going to be out of business at some point soon? We keep trying to figure out when Nikki Haley is going to drop out potentially. How about RFK Jr.?
RFK Jr., I don't know how he's going to keep doing. His support has remained flat at, in the double digits, but not high double. I mean, it's in the 10 to somewhere between 10 and 20%.
Yeah.
That's been staying that way. The people who are interested in RFK Jr. are there. He doesn't seem to be out there enough gaining support or losing support, so I don't know. As long as he has money, he will stay in to provide some alternative to people. And remember, our polling shows he polls from both the Trump and Biden supporters, depending on which side of Kennedy you are focused on.
Then there's Dean Phillips. Now, a lot of folks might not realize he's still in the race, the congressman from Minnesota. He loaned his campaign another $1 million, Wendy. He ended the month with just $200,000 on hand. What are we doing here?
He is very much trying to get a message out. He visited with us when we were in New Hampshire for the primary. He really feels it's important to keep the message going that Joe Biden is too old, that Joe Biden doesn't deserve a second term, and that it's time to go to someone else. But clearly, no Democratic primary voters are buying his argument or buying into his campaign. And at some point, I would think his own accountants will say, you're throwing good money after bad, knock it off.
Yeah, but so is it just too fun? I really want to kind of get inside the brain here a little bit. Another $1 million. Maybe he's having a blast.
Maybe he is. He certainly was animated in New Hampshire and he got some votes. And, maybe and if you're that wealthy, maybe that's fun to do. But I've never spoken to anyone who has run for president in my entire life who said it was fun.
Fair enough. Although, gosh, he got a lot of attention. And his schedule isn't quite like the others. You made a reference to a line that I think came out of this op-ed editorial board that the Wall Street Journal wrote about Nikki Haley. We'll get back to where we started with everybody asking when Nikki Haley drops out. She's being commended in this op-ed. The board writes, Haley's refusal to quit is showing tenacity. That is an important trait in a president. Is there a world in which we could look back at this period of time and say she was the only one who knew what she was doing?
Only one who knew what she was doing? I don't know. But she certainly is presenting a reasonable alternative to Donald Trump. The trouble is that Republican primary voters, who are the people who are so interested in Republican politics that they will vote, in March, February, April, and not, when everyone else is in November. Those people, those primary voters aren't, as to use the metaphor from earlier, buying what she's selling. They don't want an alternative to Donald Trump. So her best hope to even be a part of the discussion after March of being president of the United States would be to run independently as a third party, using all that Wall Street money that she's been collecting. But she's saying that's not in the cards for her.
All right, we got to put Wendy on the spot while you're with us. You see this Trump town hall last night. He kicked out the short list, or at least kind of nodded along with the short list for VP. These are all familiar names: Wendy Benjaminson, Vivek Ramaswamy, Tim Scott, Ron DeSantis, Byron Donalds, Kristi Noem, Tulsi Gabbard. Do any of them actually get the job?
That one came out of left field.
Yeah.
Sure, any one of them could get the job, depending on what Trump's mood is the day he decides to announce, But I really think to him, it's going to be who shows the most loyalty, who shows the most fealty. And that will mean this sort of trick he does where he'll say something super outrageous, something that just jaw drops to everyone in politics. And then he'll wait for one of them to support him on that. And if they sufficiently support him, they very likely will be on the ticket. We'll see. He says he wants someone who, if, God forbid something happens, will be a great president. That's sort of the baseline for picking a running mate, right?
I feel like we're heading for Kristi Noem, but I can't say that on the air, Wendy, so I won't. Great to see you.
Okay, don't say that on the air.
Keep it safe in Washington, D.C. Wendy Benjaminson, our senior editor in the nation's capital. We're going to assemble the panel next. Let's bring you up to date first on world and national news with Nancy Lyons in the Bloomberg 99.1 newsroom in Washington. Hi, Nancy.
Thanks, Joe. House Republicans are grilling President Biden's brother behind closed doors today. James Biden is testifying before the House Oversight and Judiciary Committees as part of the impeachment inquiry into the president. GOP lawmakers claim the president improperly profited from his family's overseas business dealings while vice president in the Obama administration. President Biden is calling out Donald Trump for his response to the death of Russian opposition leader Alexei Navalny. In a video posted online today, Biden said Trump and other Republicans refused to hold Vladimir Putin responsible for Navalny's death.
Trump said Navalny's death made him realize how bad America is. He said, and I quote, "We are a nation in decline, a failing nation," end of quote. Why does Trump always blame America? Putin is responsible for Navalny's death. Why can't Trump just say that?
The president also slammed Trump over his recent comments on NATO, in which Trump suggested the U.S. might not protect NATO allies who don't spend enough on defense. Global news 24 hours a day and whenever you want it with Bloomberg News Now.
It's 12:40 on Wall Street. We do check markets all day long here at Bloomberg. We have got the Dow, the S&P, NASDAQ 100 index, and the Russell 2000 all trading lower right now. Tech stocks, the underperformer, ahead of NVIDIA earnings after the close of trading today. We've got NVIDIA shares trading lower right now, down 3.2%. Traders keeping a lid on stocks ahead of those NVIDIA results, the chip maker at the heart of the AI frenzy that has powered the bull market. S&P 500 index down 14 right now. That is a drop of just about 0.3%, 49.60 on the S&P. The Dow down 95, drop there of 0.3%, while NASDAQ is down by 0.8%. 10-year, 4.30%. The 2-year, 4.65%. We do have those Fed minutes coming up at 2 o'clock Wall Street time. Mortgage rates crept higher last week, and with that story, here's Bloomberg's Vinny Del Giudice.
Mortgage rates topped 7% for the first time since December, a threat to the housing recovery. Mortgage rates are twice as high as 2021, though off their peak, the highest in a generation. Inflation, the labor market, and how the Federal Reserve responds will define the direction of mortgage rates. The data are published by the Mortgage Bankers Association. Vinny Del Giudice, Bloomberg Radio.
In the meantime, speaking of housing, shares of the luxury home builder Toll Brothers up now by 5%. Toll at a record, as the company said it is optimistic about its prospects for a key selling season. 10-year again, 4.30%. We've got Bitcoin right now down 2%, 50,982. Gold down 0.1%, 2,022 the ounce. And West Texas Intermediate crude up 1%, 77.81 a barrel. I'm Charlie Pellet. Balance of Power continues. Here he is in New York now, Joe Matthew.
All right, Charlie, we thank you and glad to have you with us on Balance of Power today. Live from World Headquarters in New York, Kaylee Lyons will join us from Washington coming up at the top of the hour as we assemble our panel today. There was hope that something might come out of Miami. You put everybody together in a hotel, a beautiful place, the Mandarin Oriental. The Speaker of the House is there, the warm breeze coming through the palm trees. Imagine a world in which they emerge with a deal to keep the government from closing when they come back, or maybe to move Ukrainian funding, or do something on the border. None of those appeared to have happened. With the headline on Axios today, House Republicans privately expect shutdown. And some folks are saying it out loud now. Familiar names, Bob Good, those in the Freedom Caucus actually think a shutdown might be good for the Republican conference to gather some leverage. That's where we start our conversation with the panel. Jeannie Shanzano is with us, Bloomberg Politics contributor, live from the nation's capital. Somehow we traded cities. And Chapin Fay is with us in studio with me in New York, managing director at Actum Republican Strategist. Great to see both of you. Chapin, are you disappointed that we're not having a more productive conversation with so little time to figure this out? The government's set to start shutting down a week from Friday.
Well, you know, these conversations go on even when the government is not in session. But people are getting worried, right? Republicans went from, cautiously optimistic to a deal to now everyone seems to think we're going to head to a government shutdown. We're in a different place than we were. The last speaker lost his job because he was working with Democrats.
That's right.
And so that's certainly in the mind of the current speaker. I don't know that we know exactly what his posture is going to be, which I think some Republicans are grumbling about now too, because that's what we do as Republicans. We grumble about things. But yeah, I think the conversations need to happen, and they're leaving it to the last second, though the pressure might help come to the table at some point.
Well, it's interesting. I wonder, Jeannie, if Democrats are going to play a role in this to maybe give the speaker some cover. This is fascinating to me. A resolution from Josh Gottheimer, a Democrat from New Jersey, not typically the man standing there to bail out Republicans. He's got a resolution that would essentially change the rules on a motion to vacate. It would require Democratic or Republican Party leadership to sanction a vote to vacate the speaker's chair. Is this the kind of thing that we need to see to give Mike Johnson the space to do his job?
It probably is. First of all, I'm very jealous that you're both there. And I came to D.C., Joe, and you went to New York. Go figure.
I feel awful.
But, you know, I do think we do need rule changes, but the reality is the Republicans put these rules in place because they wanted to remove power from leadership. And that is an enormous problem and has been in the Republican caucus. You need leadership to keep a body this big and this heterogeneous moving forward. And the problem here is the lack of power that leadership has. And we've seen it over and over again. You know, Mike Johnson has, you know, the least legislative experience of a speaker since the 1800s. But the reality is God himself could not lead this caucus under these circumstances. It's not just Mike Johnson. We saw it with Kevin McCarthy. We saw it with John Boehner. We saw it with Tim Ryan. I mean, you can just keep going back. So Republicans are going to have to wake up to the reality that a House needs to be led, and especially when you give the leader a 2-seat margin as they've done. So, you know, he's hoping he can keep his seat and keep the government funded, but it's going to be a real trick to make that happen under these circumstances with, 3 days left when they come back from vacation.
Chapin, the current rules allow any single member to trigger a vote on a motion to vacate. Is it time to change that rule and give the speaker more breathing room?
Listen, we can have a discussion about that. It might be, but I don't know that it's possible. You know, Jeannie was really hit the nail on the head. I mean, the Republicans made these rules to roll back the power of leadership.
Yeah.
And these are the consequences of that. Sure. And we're seeing them play out.
Nobody wants to do it again, though, is all I keep hearing, that no one has the stomach to fire the speaker again.
I think it would be a hard lift. I think it'll also be a hard lift for the Democrats. You know, the Democrats got their attempt to sort of help the Republicans hurt themselves. And, you know, I don't think it'll be good for either party if that moves forward the same way. You know, I mean, leadership, the speaker has been declining in power for a bunch of Congresses now, right? The dirty little secret used to be earmarks, where, you know, three swing members would sit in the back of the room, you know, basically putting their vote for sale to see what they could get out of leadership. That really doesn't happen anymore. And I would argue that wasn't even necessarily the worst thing in the world. You know, the government worked. At least it moved forward. Now it's so politicized, so ideological, that the speaker doesn't really have the power to put it crassly, buy off the Freedom Caucus, for example, right? They believe in what they believe in, and earmarks are no longer really that much of a power. So, you know, the speaker really has to do it based on personality, and, you know, it's a lot harder for the speaker to sort of corral a caucus than it used to be.
Meanwhile, you've got Donald Trump on the phone, Jeannie, and I think we get closer to your point. Even God couldn't manage that conference.
That's right. You know, and some people calling Donald Trump the real Speaker of the House. You know, and you know, I would push it back even further. Some people say that some of this started to unravel when we introduced things, and I hate to say it because I love myself some C-SPAN, but when you introduce cameras into Congress and you allow people to fundraise as individuals rather than as part of a team of Republicans or Democrats, you incentivize them to sort of go rogue and to say the most outrageous things to get, you know, airtime, and then, of course, to get the money they need to run. And so all of these things coupled together have made the job of governing more difficult. And the reality is we are all suffering because of it. I just was looking at the numbers. This Congress, seriously a do-nothing Congress, I think they've only passed 38 bills. That is a record low, and so many things need to be done. The most basic, of course, fund the government. They control the budget. And that's what we're seeing over and over again. Because let's not forget, we're in a CR right now. If they do another one, which they may well have to do, we are just continuing a bad trajectory here.
That's right. And if it keeps going like this, by April 30th, the sequester will kick in. We'll have an across-the-board budget cut because, well, this is why we can't have nice things. Chapin, I wonder your thought here on Ukraine funding. If we can't figure out the border deal, it's making that look a lot less likely. And you've got Congressman Chris Smith, Republican from New Jersey, calling on Joe Biden to do an address to the nation to make the case. You've got a Republican making that call now. We only have a minute left. Is he right?
I think he's right. I think it's very hard for, regardless of whether you support it or not, support for Ukraine. Americans are seeing a lot of complicated things here in America, here abroad, and people are going to have to start making hard decisions. We elect our representatives to make hard decisions, and you can't please everyone forever, and we're getting to the point, we're getting to a boiling point. So if we want to watch billions of dollars get sent to Ukraine, there's got to be a very good justification for it. Meanwhile, here, we're feeling repercussions here in New York City of the border crisis, right? If you're not going to address that, the same amount of money you're addressing Ukraine, we need to hear why at a very minimum.
We'll see if he uses the Oval or the White House in prime time. Of course, we'd bring you those remarks if the president chooses to do so. Most likely, though, the next time we'll see the president speaking at night will be the State of the Union, assuming, of course, the government doesn't shut down. That's set for just a couple of days later, less than a week after the shutdown begins. We'll have more with the panel next. This is Bloomberg.
Your company news headlines on Bloomberg Radio.
From Bloomberg World Headquarters, I'm Charlie Pelletin. Video reports after the close of trading today. Vijay Rakesh is senior analyst at Mizuho Securities.
Yeah, I think if you look at the guide for April quarter, which is where all the investors will be focusing on, I think we are looking for about 22 billion on the top line, with about 20 billion of that from data center. But expectations are probably running much, much harder. I think it's probably in the 25 billion range, 23 to 25 billion. So that's what where expectations are. The one thing I would say is the AI continues to grow very well. Even for 2024, AI is growing almost 90 to 100% in revenues for NVIDIA.
Indeed, all about AI, artificial intelligence. NVIDIA down now by 3.2%. You can hear more of that conversation on the Surveillance podcast. You can download it wherever you get your podcasts. Also today, after the close of trading, Analog Devices, that stock up now by 2%. Synopsys will also be reporting after the close of trading. Synopsys down now by 1.4%. And again, very important, NVIDIA lower now ahead of earnings, down by 3.2%. The other big tech story today, Palo Alto Networks. The shares down now by 26.7%. Palo Alto was headed for its biggest decline in 7 years after the cybersecurity company cut its annual revenue forecast, stoking concerns that customers are reining in spending despite an uptick in attacks. We've got shares of Palo Alto down now by 26.6%. Amazon finally joining the Dow Jones Industrial Average. Shares up now by 0.5%. The e-commerce giant will replace Walgreens Boots Alliance. That stock down 2.9%. All of this will come prior to the open of trading on Monday, February 26. And those are our top company stories at this hour. I'm Charlie Pellet, and this is Bloomberg.
This is Balance of Power with Joe Matthew on Bloomberg Radio.
You've heard all of the names, but to find out now that Donald Trump is actually considering them, should he close the deal on the Republican nomination, just makes it a little bit more interesting. He sat for a town hall, or stood for one on Fox last evening. Laura Ingraham holding forth with the former president of the United States. They talked about a lot of stuff, his legal issues, and then, yes, what would the Veep stakes look like if he becomes the nominee? Let's reassemble our panel for their take. Chapin Fay from Actum is with me, Republican strategist here at World Headquarters in New York. Jeannie Shanzano, Democratic analyst, Bloomberg Politics contributor, is at our Bloomberg Bureau in Washington, D.C. All right, Chapin, let's look at these names because you've heard them all. Vivek Ramaswamy, Tim Scott, Ron DeSantis. Really? I don't know about that. Byron Donalds, Governor Kristi Noem, and Tulsi Gabbard. Are we just talking for the fun of it here, or is that the real shortlist?
Listen, with Donald Trump, I mean, the real shortlist could be none of those names, or it could be all of them or just one of them.
Would any of them help his chances in a general election?
Sure. I mean, the first thing you look for is electoral votes. I'm not sure, many of them have the case for that other than DeSantis, right? Yes. Florida's an important state. It's been somewhat close in the past, so that would help him there. But for example, Tim Scott, South Carolina shouldn't really be a huge problem for the Trump campaign, though Senator Scott would be a great vice president, personality-wise and profile. And Vivek, I think, is too much like Trump, right? Is Trump really going to want someone like Trump out there making his own news?
Any of them, though, really?
You could. I don't know. I think Senator Scott is probably the most reasonable on the list. Yeah. I don't know that he's. Well, yes. What you're saying is, would Trump want any of them out there making news?
Well, yeah.
I think a standard politician, which was sort of Pence, right? Was a standard politician. You knew he could go out, give a speech, not embarrass him, not say anything stupid. I think that's more Trump's speed than someone who's going to go out and compete for headlines.
Mike Pence brought something to the table, though, Jeannie. He brought evangelical voters. Would anyone move the needle here, or does it not actually matter? Maybe that's the point that we're finding as we talk this out together here. Any of these names would work. None of these names would work. It's just about Trump, isn't it?
Is it ever about anything else, Joe Matthew? It is all about Trump. I have come up with a very good idea. He should do, forget The Apprentice, he should do The Veep. And we should see a reality TV show where these people contest to be VP.
Chapin's nodding.
I don't see.
This is a moneymaker, Jeannie.
Chapin, it's a good, listen, I come with the ideas. The reality is that he doesn't want to be shown up. I don't see any of these people really bringing electoral votes in this short list. I suspect somebody like Tim Scott, if you're thinking politically, you don't want to take out of the Senate at this point. He is a fabulous idea. So I think he may look elsewhere. Who knows? Do we see an RFK Jr.? Do we see a general or somebody from the military? There's an awful lot of ways to go on this. So I think he's just going to tease us for a bit while we all try to scratch our heads and figure out who it is. But I'm going to sell him my idea for the Veep.
Okay.
And share the proceeds
Jeannie's
with you and
$1 million
Chapin.
idea. We're going to lose her now. What do you think?
Listen, careful what you wish for. If he can put his name on it and make some money and get his name even more out there,
done.
I think he would do that in a second. The only other point I think Jeannie's exactly right what she said. The only point I would make is depending on where the president's current or President Trump's current residence is, he couldn't pick DeSantis anyway because they currently live in the same state.
There you
I
go.
believe.
Byron Donald's another problem.
I'm not sure of the law about whether he can, re-register back in New York or
right.
whatever, but those.
You
that
wonder
includes them.
who presents the greatest potential contrast standing next to Kamala Harris in a televised debate. Is it Kristi Noem?
Listen, I would, I'm the Republican on the panel. I think any of them that you just listed would be a great contrast with the vice president. I think Kristi Noem would be great. I think any of them. I think all of them proved, some a little bit quicker than others, that they can be fierce debaters.
Sure.
So I would put any of them up against.
I'm still scratching my head over the Tulsi Gabbard thing, but it's American politics. What can we say? All right, Jeannie and Chapin will be back in hour 2 as we talk about the fundraising numbers that came in late last night. Kaylee's on the way in. Hour 2 starts right now.
From the world of politics to the world of business, this is Balance of Power.
Okay, today I'm going to talk about how to succeed with a startup. Obviously, more than can be said here in 20 minutes, but I will do the best I can. The most important thing, the number one lesson we try to teach startups is that the degree to which you're successful approximates the degree to which you build a product that is so good, people spontaneously tell their friends about it. Startups always ask us for the secret to success. They always want to believe it's something other than this, because this is really hard to do. But this is it. If you can build a product that is so good, people spontaneously tell their friends about it, you have done 80% of the work that you need to be a really successful startup. If you think about the most successful companies you know, Google, Facebook, whatever, you probably found out about them because a friend of yours said, you got to try this, it's great. So this is the bar. Something that people love so much they tell their friends about it. One important indicator for a product like that is a product that's simple to explain and easy to understand. If you can't explain in a few words what you do, and if at least some people don't say, oh, that's pretty interesting, that's usually a mistake. It's usually a sign of unclear thinking or a need that is not big enough.
About this hour with Kaylee in D.C. I'm at World Headquarters in New York, right alongside Charlie Pellet, who, as always, starts us off with a look at Wall Street. Hey, Charlie.
Well, hello there, Joe Matthew, and hello, Kaylee. We are all about NVIDIA, Bloomberg Radio, Bloomberg Television. We've got you covered. That breaks after the close of trading. Yes, we will be there with instant analysis as those numbers hit. Right now, we've got NVIDIA shares ahead of earnings. It is a big deal. Right now, NVIDIA lower by 3.2%.
From the UK, and I'm the inventor of the gel razor. And today I'm looking for an angel investor to fund my project, the gel razor, whether that's a working concept and working prototype, or manufacturing possibilities with investment, or to get me a licensing deal secured. If you go in any supermarket today, you will see packets of razors sold separately with tins of mousse or gel. Hence I did that all in one. The idea is you pressurize the handle. The gel flows through the reservoir up to the head of the razor, coating the blades, ready for shave. My target market is 18 plus, male or female, male blue version, female pink version. What I'm looking for in an investor is someone who's passionate, determined, shares my vision. That's an important step for me, and willing to succeed as I wanted to succeed myself. Patented in the UK in 2021 September. With copyright protection, I have a logo for the gel razor, which you will see on my LinkedIn profile. Currently working with a company in the US who have done me a lovely sell sheet. Big up to them guys. So if you're interested, contact me on LinkedIn profile, Paul J. Gwilt, GWILT, or email me at mufc219@gmail.com.
Year, then again in mid-November, and now here we are trying to see if one can be avoided again. Granted, it's not an outright shutdown because it was a laddered continuing resolution that passed last time, so it would just be a partial shutdown beginning March 1st. You only need, I believe, 4 of these.
As folks like Bob Good tell the speaker to use this as leverage, do they have his ear?
You know, the speaker is not really revealing his cards at this point. Our reporting out of that Miami leadership retreat is that no real decisions were revealed either on the shutdown avoidance strategy or on Ukraine aid. You know, generally the speaker has been more open to compromising on the shutdown. We know that he personally doesn't believe it's good politics, thinks it sort of hands Democrats an issue. But there's a lot of pressure coming from Trump and you know, the hard right to sort of leverage the shutdown. So it may be in some ways irresistible. He's on very thin ice as far as his ability to hold on to the gavel. He's got basically a 2-vote margin. Anyone can call this motion to vacate. Now, his biggest asset is fatigue. That took a 3-week battle in October to replace Kevin McCarthy. People don't really want to go through that again. They'll probably end up with someone similar to Mike Johnson, but the threats are out there. You know, on the Ukraine aid versus the shutdown, he showed much more of a sort of a hard position, really continuing to demand border control changes. And interestingly, the president over the weekend sort of reversed his position. The White House has been rebuffing the speaker on a one-on-one meeting, now seems open to it. We have all ears to the ground as to when that's going to be scheduled, probably sometime next week.
Well, Eric, you just raised the threat of a motion to vacate that Speaker Johnson probably always has in the back of his mind as he's making decisions, but it's noteworthy that there's been news within the last day or so that a Democrat, the Congressman Josh Gottheimer, is now floating a resolution to essentially help change the rules so that Johnson would be more protected from that any one member who may decide to file such a thing. Could that actually gain traction? Because we know the Democrats did not step in to help Kevin McCarthy.
You know, Johnson, since he became speaker, has talked favorably of changing the rules, saying it doesn't really make much sense, you know, to have this one, you know, person change. But I think the Freedom Caucus would certainly be rebellious, and you know, even if that change went into effect, it probably would term limit Johnson in the sense that if they retained the House, he'd be unlikely to get enough support to stay in the job. You know, just because the right would be stung by this rules change. So it's going to be a tough calculation. I think we would really have to be in a very prolonged shutdown or some kind of, crisis like that for this sort of thing to pass through Congress, for Johnson to go ahead and sort of term limit himself.
Eric, it's good to have you. Eric Wasson, one of the few left on the Hill today, Bloomberg congressional reporter with the latest here. Kaylee, we'd be looking at the beginnings of a shutdown, just for the benefit of our audience, a week from Friday. And as we were just discussing with Eric, two-pronged here. This is the laddered CR. So March 8th is the second date, just to get everyone's heads around these spending bills. We haven't even mentioned Ukraine and Israel, or Taiwan for that matter, the emergency supplemental funding request, Kaylee, that passed the Senate but does not appear to have a path in the House. There's an incredible debate happening right now while that is on hold in Washington before the UN Security Council, isn't there?
Yeah, there is, regarding Israel and the actions it is taking in the Gaza Strip, the threat it poses to civilian life, as we have seen civilian casualties, according to the health ministry in Gaza, that are roughly at 30,000 now. The U.S. yesterday vetoing a Security Council resolution that would have called for an immediate ceasefire in Gaza. That resolution, of course, was put forward by Algeria, which is the Arab member that is rotating on the Security Council currently. Right. But the reason for the U.S. veto this time was they have an alternative, Joe, a ceasefire still, but of a temporary nature.
That's exactly right. And so we'll see, of course, the U.S. with veto power blocking this first draft. Now, maybe the U.S. version will be taken up. That's where Carmel Arbit comes in with the Atlantic Council. Carmel has been a reliable voice for us, helping to understand the contours of all of this since the war began. Senior Fellow at the Atlantic Council for Middle East Programs and the Scowcroft Middle East Security Initiative. Carmel, thanks for being with us. Will the U.S. version of this ceasefire pass the Security Council?
I think what's really remarkable, and you noted this earlier, is that the U.S. has really been unwavering in its support for Israel during this war. And we've seen that really from day one, where they have said Israel has a right to defend itself, to take out Hamas, and we will stand with it. It has defended Israel at the ICJ today, and as you noted, is bringing forth its own proposal in front of the UN. What it has sought to do is to essentially shield Israel from international community pressure to immediately pursue a permanent ceasefire. What the U.S. is calling for instead is the release of all hostages in exchange for a temporary ceasefire. Whether or not it will pass remains to be seen.
Well, Carmel, how telling is it to you that we are using the words, the U.S. is using the words temporary ceasefire when before it was pauses?
I would say potato, potato. The truth is, in practice, those are the same
things. It seemed
things.
It mattered initially.
It mattered because the rhetoric mattered to the people who were hearing it. So Israel needed to hear at the beginning of this war that the United States was going to stand behind it through a pause. And by not using the word ceasefire, they avoided joining the international community and pressuring Israel to stop its operation in Gaza or to restrain itself. The U.S. has shifted in its rhetoric, in part because as the war has gone on, the toll has been, in fact, devastating. It's been devastating for nearly 30,000 Gazans who have been killed, and it's remained devastating for Israelis who are displaced from their homes and remain in fear so long as Hamas remains in power. That said, the U.S. is also conscious of its own domestic constituency and the pushback that it is getting for its support for Israel. And so with that in mind, they've started to adopt language like a temporary ceasefire, mirroring calls for a permanent ceasefire, but not actually demanding it. And so in practice, the reality is the same. The question will only be that through negotiations, how long a pause or a ceasefire actually lasts.
The vote in the Security Council yesterday, 15 members, was 13-1. The UK abstained. Carmel, what did the other members think of the U.S. veto?
The United States faces a huge amount of opposition and pressure around the world, particularly among its Arab allies, for its support for Israel. That's not new to this conflict. That's something that has gone on for a long time. But the U.S. has also shown that it is willing to stand up at the UN, to stand on its own 2 feet, to use its veto power at the Security Council to assert itself as a world leader. The reality is that the international community, and specifically the UN, has been ineffective to date in driving peace or progress between Israelis and Palestinians. That has been done most effectively, although with limits, between the parties themselves through the support of negotiations and through the support of countries like the United States and other Arab allies who are bringing the countries together behind closed doors.
Well, Carmel, as you talk about the U.S. standing up to those at the UN, I wonder about the U.S. standing up more so, President Biden specifically, to Benjamin Netanyahu. One of our opinion columnists here at Bloomberg, Andreas Kluth, had a piece out this morning that says the right-wing government of Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and its seemingly indiscriminate war in the Gaza Strip, which may yet be ruled genocidal, is leaving Biden little choice. He must distance himself if he doesn't want to sacrifice American credibility in the so-called global South forever. Is that really what is at risk here?
I think that Joe Biden is dealing with a difficult dilemma in that he deeply supports Israel, the state, the country, the cause. But he has always had challenges with Netanyahu, and we have seen that all the way through. He does not support the government itself or many of the positions that Netanyahu has pursued, particularly as Netanyahu has both veered to the right with his right-wing government, but also is making decisions in many cases that are motivated by his own personal interest in remaining in power as he faces corruption charges. And so those tensions have always been there. And so Biden has done a really good job of differentiating between the needs of the state of Israel and the politics of Netanyahu. We are seeing that conflict really come into the spotlight. And I would frankly expect it to worsen as we come into the Ramadan holiday, where Netanyahu is thinking very much about his domestic political audience, and Biden is much more concerned about the safety and security of the region and the U.S.'s role.
Carmel, that U.S. proposal before the Security Council that we're talking about here warns against an Israeli assault on Rafah. We're separately seeing stories today on the terminal. The U.K. is considering restricting arms sales to Israel if, in fact, Israel launches an offensive in Rafah. It appears that it's just a matter of timing here. It's a question of when, not if, that occurs. Will that be a turning point in Western support for Israel?
Yeah, so the Israelis say that they have taken out about half of Hamas operatives, and that Rafah really remains the one major stronghold of Hamas battalions. It's notable that Israeli operatives extracted 2 hostages who were being held in Rafah. This is really only the second time they've successfully done this through an operation. And so the Israelis have made clear that in order to achieve their objectives in Gaza of removing Hamas from power, that they believe they must enter Rafah. This is, as you know, deeply concerning for the international community. There are more than 1.5 million Palestinian civilians who have been displaced into Rafah, who have been pushed further to the south. Many have been displaced multiple times, are living in tent encampments. If they are displaced yet again, we could be talking about only a worsened humanitarian crisis in the region. It will cause significant tensions between Israel and the international community, and that's part of the reason that the U.S. is trying to fold this in to a UN effort, but really also focusing on negotiations privately with the Israelis, where they have insisted that they must put forward a credible, implementable proposal for dealing with those civilians.
All right, Carmel, thank you so much, as always, for joining us. Carmel Arbit joining us from the Atlantic Council. And as we talk about Rafah, Joe, we did hear from Israeli Minister Benny Gantz earlier today, who said an operation in Rafah will begin after the population is evacuated from the area, reiterates that if there is no hostage deal, which he does say there are signs it could move forward, the Israeli military will operate in Rafah during Ramadan.
It's fascinating stuff as we understand moment by moment what's happening over there, Kaylee. We'll, of course, keep our listeners and viewers attuned to what's happening at the Security Council. The panel's next on Bloomberg.
From Bloomberg World Headquarters, I'm Charlie Pellet. 121 right now on Wall Street. We've got stocks trading lower. The focus on NVIDIA after the close of trading. That stock right now down 3.5%. Bloomberg Radio, Bloomberg Television, we've got you covered on those earnings when they break after the close of trading. Right now, the S&P lower by 12, down by about 0.25%. Dow Industrials down 58 now, drop there of 0.1%. NASDAQ down 107, a decline there of 0.7%. 10-year yield, 4.31% with the 2-year right now, 4.64%. Spot gold, little change, down by 0.1% right now, 2,024 the ounce, while Bitcoin down 1.9%, and West Texas Intermediate crude up 0.5%, 77.46 for a barrel of WTI. Bitcoin, by the way, just above 51,043. Again, all about NVIDIA. NVIDIA shares now lower by 3.5%. Amazon next week will join the Dow Jones Industrial Average, replacing Walgreens Boots Alliance. Amazon up 0.6%. Walgreens down now by 2.9%. S&P down 10, drop there of 0.2%. Balance of power continues. Once again, Kaylee Lyons and Joe Matthew.
I appreciate it, Charlie Pellet. Great to be with you from World Headquarters in New York. Kaylee is in Washington, D.C. The most frequently asked question on this program, I think since the beginning of the year, Kaylee, or at least since Iowa, has been, when is Nikki Haley going to drop out of the race? Pretty tough for Nikki Haley, I guess, particularly when she continues to raise gobs of money. It's a fascinating dual narrative here. We had our fundraising deadline last night. We're looking at the numbers today. Yep. Kaylee, for the first time, she outraised Donald Trump.
Yeah, raised $16.5 million in the month of January, which of course is when we saw her coming in third in Iowa, coming in a distant second in New Hampshire, when hopes had been higher for her performance in that state. And yet she still was able to raise that amount relative to former President Trump, who took in just $8.8 million for his campaign. And of course, you have to think about the money coming in versus the money going out, because the Trump campaign spent more money than it raised. Their burn last month was $11.4 million, and it speaks to a very tricky financial picture for the former president, who has a lot of legal bills he needs to pay.
Another $3 million from the leadership PAC Save America just for attorney's fees in the month of January. And we're talking about trials beginning later in this calendar year, Kaylee. But there were a lot of interesting narratives to come out of this. Joe Biden continues to outraise everybody.
$42 million in January. He's sitting on a pretty pile of $130 million. I guess the question is, how well can you put that to use in a general election campaign when right now you are lagging behind Trump in most polls, especially in swing states? So on that note, let's get to our political panel. Joining us now with me here in Washington, Jeannie Sheehan Zaino, our Bloomberg Politics contributor, and with Joe in New York, Chapin Fay, Acta Managing Director and Republican strategist. So Jeannie, just to start with you, we often talk about how Trump is just a different kind of candidate. He gets all of this free earned media going in and out of court. Yes, may cost him money and attorney's fees, but it also gets him airtime because all the networks are covering it. To what extent does traditional campaign financing matter to a candidate like him?
You know, it has been so fascinating to watch Donald Trump. I was just thinking back to 2016 when I would say, sort of naive things like Hillary Clinton likely has the upper hand because she raised famously over $1 billion. But Donald Trump obviously won, and he won pretty handily in the Electoral College. And part of that was because of this earned media. And he is such a master at getting that earned media in a way other politicians like Hillary Clinton, like Joe Biden, have not been as proficient as. So he can still do that, and certainly these court cases will help. But as you were just talking to Joe about, the burn rate is tremendous. I'm thinking, you're reporting he spent how much on legal fees in $3 million in January, and the court cases have barely kicked in. Imagine as we get into March and then April and May. So he's going to have hefty bills. The burn rate's going to be higher, but nobody is more masterful than Donald Trump at getting that free media. So that is going to be important, and that's why Joe Biden, this juggernaut that he is of fundraising, has got to use the time now to fundraise big, and they are doing that.
They sure are. I want to put a finer point on what Kaylee was mentioning, Chapin, in terms of Donald Trump, the exception to every rule. He's not even been on the air in South Carolina. He's about to win the primary by 20 to 30 points against the hometown candidate here. And so I wonder, is fundraising actually a mechanism for him to pay legal fees as opposed to pay for the campaign, the advertising, and all the traditional stuff? Because if he's the king of earned media, what does it matter?
Well, he is the ultimate disruptor in politics, right? I mean, he turns every rule on its head. It cuts both ways. His name recognition has got to be close to 100%. So electorally, the people who have not made up their minds yet about the two candidates, or the presumably two candidates, that group is shrinking, I think, by day. And he does have a lot of legal jeopardy going on, and that is what is eating up all of his fundraising. But his base is so behind him, forcefully behind him, that he can raise those small dollar donors fairly easily. I'd be curious to see the breakdown between Nikki Haley's and Donald Trump's, small dollar grassroots donations. And the other thing I would make about the fundraising is, as the non-Trump candidates sort of got whittled down to one, it was that their voters, the money, all of that was always going to coalesce, or likely coalesce around one person, which is what Nikki Haley is benefiting from right now. The problem, numbers-wise, for her is that he got more than everyone else combined, in all the polls and all the, and now that we're seeing election results. So query whether she can make a dent electorally, but certainly she'll have the funds to keep going, because there are a lot of people who just, it's so polarized, you either love Donald Trump or you don't, right? And she's getting all the money.
I'd like to ask you about the fact that she's getting money. This is Bloomberg. We talk about investments here. Typically, people don't like to put good money after bad investments. There is no poll in which Nikki Haley shows that she can beat Donald Trump to be the Republican nominee. There's no clear path. What does it say that people are still throwing a ton of money at her as she tries and ultimately very likely will fail?
That's a great question. I always like to say in campaign finance and fundraising for clients that, it's an investment, right? You have to prove to the donor why they should invest in you. I think it's a little different than that on the political side. People are ideological. People give because they're emotional. The federal limits are such that, you can't be giving $50,000 to one candidate through, the traditional campaign apparatus. So that tampers that down a little bit. And listen, politics is about, and campaigns are about putting yourself in the best possible position to capitalize on opportunity. So that's what's happening, right? Who knows if President Trump will be in jail or not, right? Or who knows, what his ability to run after, he goes through this legal process will be. So that's sort of what all the Republicans earlier in this race were planning on, right? Be in the best possible position when whatever happens, right? General election in November is still a lifetime away. There's still, questions as to who the candidates are going to be. I don't know if they're real questions, but there's still questions. So I think there's plenty of time for something, I don't know what that crazy thing would happen, because around President Trump, crazy things always happen. But to preclude him from being the nominee, who knows? And she'll run into the convention. She's hoping she'll run strong and have the money and the support, and see what happens.
I don't know, Jeannie. We haven't seen the money from the shoes yet. The gold sneakers, that's still pre-order money, and the jury's out until this happens. But we're playing the Veep stakes today after Donald Trump held a town hall on Fox last evening. They are all very familiar names, and I wonder if any of them might move the needle for you, whether it's Ramaswamy, Tim Scott, somehow Ron DeSantis is on this list. I don't think we're going there. Byron Donalds, also Florida. Governor Kristi Noem and Tulsi Gabbard, both on this so-called short list. Jeannie, is he gaslighting us, or is this the actual list? Will it be one of these?
Yeah, I trust him completely, Joe Matthew, never to gaslight anyone. And I'm going to get you and Kaylee those sneakers as soon as this pre-order session is over.
That's a lot of money.
It's a lot of money, but you guys are worth it. I think, the name I think that stuck out to most of us on the list from last night was Tulsi Gabbard. But, as you think about it, I like to follow what's going on in the right wing. And she has been somebody who has been turning up at Turning Point USA. She is somebody who is attractive to people on his side. So when you think of it from that perspective, it's not that surprising. But I think in the end, if you go back to what he did with Mike Pence, the reality is he's going to want somebody who brings something to the table like the evangelicals and who does not steal his thunder in the earned media. And so I think those two things combined, perhaps we aren't seeing the complete list yet, and that'll be forthcoming. But it's going to be fun because this looks like it may be a very long general election. So we may have a lot of time to think about the Veep stakes.
Indeed. Can't wait. Going to be very, very exciting. Chapin, I want to ask you, though, about something else that Trump said in that town hall on Fox last night. He was talking about all the legal issues he is facing, including that ruling that came down in New York that he has to pay well over $300, perhaps over $400 million in that civil suit related to the Trump organization. He compared that to what happened to Alexei Navalny, who died in Russia in a prison in the Arctic last week. He said it is a form of Navalny, it is a form of communism or fascism. Who is buying that argument that these things are in any way comparable?
Well, first of all, his supporters, the people who support Donald Trump, believe the things that he says. What I would say about some of the things Trump says is he has his style, and the way he says things people tend to grasp onto the way he says things and talk about how awful it is, when the point that he's trying to make is about political opponents coming after. They're using the courts and the court system and sort of trying to use every method other than the ballot box to defeat their opponents, which is what he feels like is happening to him, and his supporters certainly feel like it's happening to him, and even non-Trump Republicans are very uncomfortable with the way things seem to be going down. The Attorney General of New York said she was going to find a crime to prosecute him for. Right? That's not how prosecutors in this country are supposed to conduct themselves. So it makes people wonder what exactly is going on. So to answer your point, I think that people, he needs to keep his people motivated. Saying stuff like that will keep it motivated. And to, I forget who made the point earlier, I think it was Jeannie, about his just mastery of earned media. Saying things like that gets him right back in the news, gets him right back to the top of the hour on every single show, gets his supporters all up and angry. He probably can raise money off of it. So there is a method to his madness. Do we like what he says all the time? No, of course we don't. But hope that answered your question a little bit. That filibuster.
It is quite a line. When asked about the fine from his New York business fraud case, he said, quote, "It is a form of Navalny," unquote. With our panel, great conversation. Chapin Fay, thank you for being with us here in New York. Jeannie Shanzano in Washington, D.C. More ahead with myself and Kaylee Lyons on Balance of Power after we bring you up to date on world and national news. For that, we turn to Nancy Lyons in the Bloomberg 99.1 newsroom in Washington. Hi, Nancy.
Thanks, Joe. James Biden says his brother, President Biden, never had any involvement in his business dealings or the dealings of other family members. He appeared today for a private interview by House Republicans who were conducting an impeachment inquiry into President Biden. Former President Donald Trump is finally saying a little more about the death of Russian opposition leader Alexei Navalny. During a Fox News town hall on domestic and foreign policy challenges, he mentioned that he thought Navalny was brave.
Frankly, probably would have been a lot better off staying away and talking from outside of the country as opposed to having to go back in, because people thought that could happen, and it did happen, and it's a horrible thing.
Trump was widely criticized for admitting sympathy for Navalny in an earlier Truth Social post. Former President Trump's campaign is starting to spend more than it's raising. The latest filings with the Federal Election Commission show the 2024 campaign took in $8.8 million last month, but doled out $11.4 million. Global news 24 hours a day and whenever you want it with Bloomberg News Now. I'm Nancy Lyons. This is Bloomberg.
It's 1:40 on Wall Street from Bloomberg World Headquarters in New York. I'm Charlie Pellet. We begin with a developing story, a headline right off the Bloomberg Professional Service. Boeing says the head of the 737 MAX program, Ed Clark, will be leaving the company. Word did come in an email to employees. Boeing shares right now, they are trading lower. We've got Boeing down now by 0.3%. Again, repeating the headline right now on the Bloomberg Professional Service, the head of the 737 MAX program, Ed Clark, will be leaving Boeing. Stocks lower across the board ahead of NVIDIA earnings after the close of trading today. NVIDIA right now down by 3.5%. Also reporting after the close of trading, Analog Devices and Synopsys. The S&P down 13 now, drop there of 0.3%. Dow Industrials down 50, a decline of 0.1%. NASDAQ down 115, right now lower by 0.7%. 10-year 4.31% with a 2-year that is now yielding 4.65%. Spot gold down 0.1%, 2022 the ounce, and West Texas Intermediate crude up 0.8%, 77.63 for a barrel of WTI. Palo Alto Networks on track for its biggest decline in 7 years after the cybersecurity company cut its annual revenue forecast, stoking concerns that customers are reining in spending despite an uptick in attacks. Palo Alto Networks now down by 27.3%. Recapping, stocks are lower with the S&P down 13, drop there of 0.3%. I'm Charlie Pellet in New York. Balance of Power continues. Once again, here's Kaylee Lines and Joe Matthew.
All right, Charlie Pellet in New York, thank you so much. It is indeed Kaylee Lines and Joe Matthew on Bloomberg TV and radio, live from both Washington, where I am, and New York, where Joe Matthew is today. And as Charlie was just checking the markets, though, I'm doing my hourly scroll of my X feed. And you know what caught my attention yesterday on X, Joe? It was a post from Stephen Chung, who's a spokesperson for the Trump campaign, responding to what Nikki Haley said in her State of the Race speech in South Carolina yesterday, in which she said she feels no need to kiss the ring being Trump's. She has no fear of Trump's retribution. He said she's going to drop down to kiss ass when she quits, like she always does. To which her campaign manager, Betsy Ankney, responded, "What a move. Stephen Chung is key to winning back suburban women." Joe.
Pretty remarkable language to see this thrown around in a public space like that, Kaylee. But, it does kind of fulfill a theme, or at least underscore a theme of this campaign, whether it's misogynistic comments from Donald Trump about women or just the fight for suburban women going back all the way before the Roe decision. It was Trump himself who said that would be stupid, that we will lose suburban women and therefore the election. And based on some of the elections that we have seen, including the midterms, he might have been onto something.
Yeah, and we'll see how potent a force it still is come November of this year when women especially go back to their voting booth. So we wanted to dig more into this subject. Joining us now, I'm pleased to say, is Jane Hall. She is American University Associate Professor of Journalism and Media Studies. Jane, great to have you on the program. As we look ahead just 4 days from now, not even getting to November, but to South Carolina, the primary in which Trump and Nikki Haley are competing, just a few days from now, the Suffolk University USA Today poll on that race released yesterday showed 40% of women said they would support Haley. 58% said they would support Trump. So does he really have a problem with female voters, or maybe just not one in South Carolina?
He has got a problem with female voters, and I am so glad you all are talking about this today. She is staying in the race against a barrage of hateful statements that, unfortunately, Trump has a history of. Attacking her husband's military service, attacking her as an imposter because he said she went up there in her fancy dress at New Hampshire. And there are all these men, frankly, behind her, Tim Scott, Vivek Ramaswamy, laughing. And there's laughter in the audience. And if you're a woman watching that, I do not think that that is what you want to see in somebody you're going to vote for president. I think she's playing the long game. As your previous guest said, we don't know what it's going to look like in November. She is saying to the media also, why do you keep asking me? And I think this is a really good point. I'm a student of media coverage. I've written a lot about this. Why do you keep asking me when I'm getting out? Why don't you ask whether he's going to win the general election? Now, she may not win, but I have to say that this kind of attitude towards women gets women out to vote. I mean, after 2016, we had the second year of the woman when women voted to bring many more women into Congress after Trump won in 2016. The gender gap, as you all know well, between women voters for the Democrats is very high. Now, Trump, has cut into Latino voters in some ways. I mean, we'll have to see how this all plays out. Mm-hmm. But I think that people may be selling Nikki Haley short. She will probably lose in South Carolina, but I don't think that should be interpreted as she should get out, or frankly, whether she might not ultimately either be positioning herself for a subsequent presidential, or she might even get votes. I mean, I know a lot of young women who might vote for her because they see what kind of barrage she's taking.
Well, Jane, what do you think of the way she's handling it? Because Nikki Haley has begun referring to the fellas. And this has been part of her narrative the past couple of weeks. I got rid of all the fellas. I'm just down to the last one, she says. She's made it a point of humor. She's been self-deprecating in talking about this. Is that the right approach?
I think so. I think I have to say, just speaking personally, I think she's handling this very well. She got choked up talking about how he attacked her husband's military deployment. But largely dealing with this as she's kind of cutting him down to size, I think, in a way, and other men by saying, I am going to push back. I am not going to respond. I mean, women always have a hard time with this kind of stuff. If they get too emotional, they're too emotional. So to say the fellas, to say, to kind of laugh at him, I think is part of what's driving him crazy. I'm not speaking to him, but I would be willing to bet that the fact that she's not getting out when all these other people have gotten out who've condemned him, I mean, she's playing it, I think, very wisely. The only way probably that she can play it is to say, oh, come on, you all know that this is ridiculous what he's saying. She could be responding and saying he's racist and sexist, but I think it's wiser to probably say, I'm not going to respond that way. I'm going to say, hey, isn't he ridiculous? That's what I personally think is what's going on with her.
What about her handling of the abortion issue in particular? She has said repeatedly that presidential candidates need to be honest with the American people about what could get 60 votes in the Senate. But what that essentially has been is her not actually committing to any week at which she thinks abortion should be banned, not taking a firm stance on this very critical, as we have seen in the midterms, reproductive issue that's on the minds of voters when they head to the polls. Is her lack of taking a firm stance on the abortion issue something that's likely to actually hurt her with the women who may be more likely to pick her over Trump and yet may not like what they see on that?
Well, I think that's a really good point. She has, Trump tried to make the quote unquote practical case too. But he is the person who put 3 Supreme Court justices, a lot of people think, on there to overturn Roe v. Wade. I think if you look at her stance, if she were to become the nominee, she would have to be more clear about what her stance is, and I don't believe that. I mean, I think that would be tricky because there are a lot of people who voted for Donald Trump in part because he, of his stance, and evangelical voters. So her not stating it specifically, I think, is wise. But if she were to get more into this, she would have to say, is she for a ban? What does she really mean about this? Now, she's sort of making the practical case a ban would never pass. That's okay for now, but I think you're right. She would have to speak more specifically about what does she really believe about this. And she hasn't said that she opposes the overturn of Roe v. Wade, as far as I know.
Yeah, and she consistently says that she is pro-life. So, of course, we keep that in mind as well. Jane, thank you so much for joining us today. Really appreciate your insight on this topic. Jane Hall, American University Associate Professor of Journalism and Media Studies, and also author of Politics and the Media, Intersections and New Directions. And interesting to have the abortion conversation with her in particular, especially in light of yesterday's ruling in Alabama, the Supreme Court there ruling that frozen embryos should be treated as children. Raises a lot of questions about the future of IVF treatments. That's something we'll continue to cover for you right here on Bloomberg.
listening to Balance of Power with Joe Matthew and Kaylee Lines on Bloomberg Radio.
The fastest show in politics cannot move on without mentioning NVIDIA. Even the political guys are talking about this. Of course, I mean, me and Kaylee here. What's going to happen after 4 o'clock, Kaylee? Because I'm here in world headquarters in New York, and I'm wondering if the building is going to shake, if I need to hold on to something. This is the only story that's going to matter after 4 o'clock.
Well, if you listen to Goldman Sachs, this is the most important stock in the world, Joe.
Yes,
so
is.
that is the kind of stakes we are dealing with here as we think about NVIDIA. This is a stock that is up, 224% over the course of the last year. A lot, though, is riding on whether or not it can meet this very high bar in terms of what appetite for the chips that are going to power this AI revolution really is. And if it's, as appetizing as investors have bet that it is when they bid up this stock.
Well, that's for sure. And, look, we're not going to game expectations here on Balance of Power, but there's a huge policy and political overlay on this whole story as NVIDIA tries to do business in China. The administration, the Commerce Department specifically, I think they have an office at NVIDIA headquarters at this point, Kaylee, because they're talking every day.
Yeah, because it's how does NVIDIA work around to make chips specifically for China that don't allow China to do things that the U.S. would not like it to do from a national security perspective? It raises a lot of questions about that market. And you mentioned the Commerce Department, Joe. It's worth noting the Commerce Secretary, Gina Raimondo, was actually talking about how the U.S. needs more chips to fund the, AI future, and that at this point she thinks that they've fell pretty far, took their eye off the ball in terms of forwarding those chip efforts. So it'll be interesting to see if we get any commentary from the company on that as well.
We'll have to, right? There's going to have to be a mention of China, and I'm sure that'll spawn a whole round of headlines, whether they're positive or negative. It's something that we are still talking about with not only the administration, Kaylee, but the China Select Committee is deeply involved in that with both Republicans and Democrats. But we're going to turn our attention to all things Fed coming up on Bloomberg Business Week here. You ready for the minutes? We got to get out of the way.
Oh, I'm always ready for the minutes. Granted, the minutes are pretty backward looking because we're talking about the meeting where we already know what they did. They held rates back in January. But it's going to be a question of, can we dissect anything to indicate what the picture is going forward, when the Fed might be thinking about when the start of rate cuts will be appropriate, as the market has kind of pushed back expectations as to when exactly that might happen.
Well, we stop down for this kind of stuff. And that's where Carol and Jennifer come in. Tim's not with us today, but I'm here in the room with both Carol and Jennifer Ryan. The minutes are on the way. Kaylee, I'll meet you at 5 o'clock for more conversation around politics here. And we'll talk about NVIDIA too on Balance of Power at 5 o'clock. Carol and Jennifer, great to see you. Take it away.
Great to see you, Joe and Kaylee, guys. Thank you so much. A very good afternoon, everybody. Live on Bloomberg Radio, TV, YouTube, Bloomberg Originals. I'm Carol Massar. Tim is out today. Lucky for us, Jennifer Ryan, Bloomberg News Editor for U.S. Markets. And Jennifer, the setup on this Wednesday, February 21st, we're going to talk about those FOMC minutes that are coming our way in just a few minutes. But really top of mind is NVIDIA after the close.
Yeah, I mean, the news is expected to impact sentiment, whatever the outcome is.
Yeah, and that's the interesting part of it. Like we talk about, here's a name that was identified with the AI euphoria and craze last year, the top performing name in the S&P 500 in 2023. It's at the top of that list again here in 2024.
And then it'll be interesting to see how the rest of the Magnificent Seven react, how the rest of the tech industry reacts on whatever we hear out of the earnings today, because there's been such a push up in the equity markets on the back of the expectations and the hopes for AI. And it remains to be seen how well investors will take any disappointment.
Well, you know better than most, right? We talk so much about market sentiment, and this is a name that I forgot. It's got the third highest weighting in the S&P 500 behind two other mega cap tech names. We're talking about Microsoft and Apple. So what happens, whether it disappoints to the downside, whether it outperforms to the upside, it will really have a lot to say when it comes to the sentiment in the market and maybe the trade that we get off of this, and maybe some new trade lines or trend trend lines, if you will.
Indeed. And then there might also be some sense coming into the reaction to the earnings.
Reality check?
Exactly. Where we sort of take a step back and say, hang on a second. There are so many big bets on AI that let's not get too wrapped up in just one earnings report.
No, it's a really important thing. And, we're going to go over the next 60 minutes. We are going to break down those minutes as soon as they cross in just about a 2 minutes time here. Our Mike McKee down there in Washington. But at the same time, getting into NVIDIA, what this company really does specifically. Sometimes I think we throw out AI, generative AI, machine learning, and kind of lump it all in one bag. And there's some very specific things about NVIDIA that make it so spectacular and why everybody's been focusing on it.
Yeah, and then exactly, we'll have some smart people on the show later on who will explain all of this to everyone listening.
Well, we're going to lean on Ian King in a big way. Having said that, in just a moment, our focus over the next 60 minutes is definitely on NVIDIA for good reason. But we're also going to talk a lot about the U.S. economy coming off those minutes, and then more broadly get into how important the strength in the U.S. economy has been to global growth, or if you will, the global outlook and the global economy.
Yeah, it's a very interesting question because you can see that just to pick an example, emerging markets who have their currencies tied to the U.S. How is this working out for them that the Fed is not going to be cutting rates as quickly as the rest of the market had anticipated?
Yeah, exactly. So we're going to get into that as well. In the meantime, we're just counting down, folks, just about a minute to those Fed minutes. Of course, it was related to the first Fed meeting of 2024 at the end of the month of January. Probably no surprises expected, Jennifer, but nonetheless, we'll see if there's some consensus in terms of what the Fed officials need to actually cut rates.
And then, if there's anything that we can read amongst the lines about how to read the latest CPI figures, which were much higher than anyone had thought.
All right, ahead of that, folks, we've got a 10-year note at 4.31, a 2-year note, the shorter end of the yield curve at 4.65. Taking a look at the equity trade, it's been a muted trade down across the board, just down about 12 on the S&P 500 and a decline of about 116 points on the NASDAQ, so down the most on a percentage basis. We do want to get to the latest, those Fed meeting minutes. We want to head to D.C. Bloomberg News International Economics and Policy correspondent Michael McKee is live at the Federal Reserve, breaking down them as they cross the Bloomberg.
Well, as of January 31st, Fed officials did not see any kind of a rate increase in their future, agreeing at their meeting the policy rate was likely at its peak for this tightening cycle. But there was no consensus on when they might start cutting and no real hints in the minutes about what they would be looking at to decide. The future path of the policy rate would depend on incoming data, the evolving outlook, and the balance of risks, the minutes say. Cutting too soon was seen as a bigger risk